The courtroom went silent the moment 13-year-old Noah Klein turned around and smiled. Not at his lawyer, not at the judge. He smiled directly at the mother of the boy he murdered, a woman who had made him breakfast, driven him to baseball games, treated him like a second son. That smile wasn't nervous or confused. It was deliberate, cold, almost playful, like he was daring her to break in front of everyone watching. The prosecutor's pen stopped moving. The bailiff's hand instinctively moved toward his belt. Judge Elaine Roark leaned forward, her neck and knuckles white against the bench, watching this child perform cruelty like it was a talent he'd practiced. Noah thought his age made him invincible. That 13 meant immunity. That courtrooms couldn't touch someone who still needed a hall pass to use the bathroom. But what Noah didn't know was that across the street from the Greenbelt where Eli Harper died, a $20 doorbell camera had captured something he thought he'd erased. And buried in his phone, deleted but not gone, was a single message that would unravel every lie he'd carefully built. He won't talk anymore. They can't prove it. Stories like this remind us that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like the kid next door. If you believe justice should reach everyone, no matter how young, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. Because what happened next will make you question everything you thought you knew about childhood innocence. This is how it all began. Briar Glen was the kind of American suburb where danger felt like something that happened to other towns, other families, other children. Mothers watched from kitchen windows as kids disappeared around corners on bicycles, trusting that familiarity meant safety, that knowing your neighbors' names was the same as knowing their hearts. Eli Harper was the boy everyone wanted their child to be: polite, helpful, loyal to a fault, the kind of 13-year-old who still hugged his parents goodbye without embarrassment. Noah Klein seemed cut from the same cloth. Sleepovers at each other's houses, inside jokes, matching Halloween costumes 3 years running. But beneath the surface of that friendship, something toxic had been festering, a need for control that looked like closeness, a violent possessiveness that masqueraded as loyalty. On an ordinary Saturday afternoon, Eli received a text from Noah asking him to meet at the Greenbelt path to talk things through. Just the two of us. Eli went willingly, even eagerly, believing his best friend wanted to make things right. He had no idea Noah had already decided this conversation would be their last. The courtroom felt too large for the child sitting at the defense table, his shoulders barely filling out the stiff button-up shirt that still had package creases running down the sleeves. Noah Klein's feet swung slightly above the floor when he shifted in his chair, a detail that made several jurors uncomfortable. The cognitive dissonance of seeing someone so physically small, accused of something so monumentally dark. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, fingers interlaced in a pose his attorney had probably coached him to maintain, the picture of youthful remorse. But when the courtroom doors opened and Eli Harper's family entered, mother, a father, and a younger sister who clutched a worn stuffed animal against her chest, Noah's carefully constructed mask slipped for just a moment. He turned his head, made direct eye contact with Marissa Harper, and smiled. It wasn't the uncertain grimace of a frightened child, or the nervous tick of someone drowning in circumstances beyond their comprehension. It was deliberate, controlled, almost curious, like he was conducting an experiment to see how much pain a human face could register before it shattered completely. The bailiff noticed first, his posture stiffening as his hand drifted instinctively toward the equipment on his belt. The prosecutor, Miguel Soria, had been reviewing notes at his table when movement in his peripheral vision made him look up, and what he saw made him set down his pen with careful precision, as though sudden movements might disturb the psychological crime unfolding in real time. Judge Elaine Roark, a 23-year veteran of the bench who had sentenced gang members, domestic abusers, and career criminals without flinching, found herself leaning forward with an expression that court observers would later describe as somewhere between disbelief and restrained fury. She had seen defendants laugh, cry, rage, and plead, but this was different. This was a child treating a murder trial like a performance where he held the only script that mattered. Noah held Marissa's gaze for 3 full seconds before his attorney, Lena Park, placed a hand on his forearm and whispered something sharp enough to make him turn back around. But the damage was done, the message delivered, even here, surrounded by the architecture of consequences. Noah Klein believed he was still in control. Marissa Harper had prepared herself for this moment with the help of a victim advocate and several sleepless nights spent rehearsing how to breathe through grief in public. She had promised herself she wouldn't give Noah the satisfaction of seeing her break, wouldn't let him turn her son's death into a spectacle where he remained the center of attention. But that smile, casual and empty as a shrug, hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment her careful composure cracked just enough for tears to slide silently down her face. Her husband reached for her hand, gripping it with the kind of desperate strength reserved for people trying to anchor each other against a flood. Their daughter, only 10 years old, and didn't understand the legal proceedings or the terminology being thrown around by adults in expensive suits. But she understood that smile. She buried her face in her mother's side, and the stuffed animal, a faded bear Eli had won for her at a county fair 2 summers ago, absorbed her quiet sobs. Across the aisle, Noah glanced at the ceiling tiles as though counting them. Bored already, his feet resuming their slight swinging motion like a metronome marking time in a room where time had stopped meaning anything to half the people present. Judge Rourke allowed the family a moment to settle before speaking, her voice low enough that it forced the entire courtroom to lean in, to strain toward her words like gravity pulling objects into orbit. She explained that this proceeding would be governed by facts, not emotions, by evidence, not assumptions, by what could be proven beyond reasonable doubt in a system designed to protect even those accused of the unthinkable. Her tone was procedural, almost clinical, but underneath it ran a current of something harder. A warning that she had presided over enough trials to recognize performance when she saw it, and that theatrical displays of either remorse or defiance would carry 0 weight in her courtroom. She made eye contact with Noah as she spoke, holding his gaze until he looked away first, a small victory that felt enormous to everyone who witnessed it. The gavel sat within easy reach of her right hand, polished wood worn smooth by decades of use, waiting to punctuate judgments that would echo long after everyone left the building. Noah's attorney had built her career on defending the indefensible, or on finding cracks of humanity in cases that seemed designed to extinguish empathy. Lena Park was not a villain. She was a true believer in the principle that everyone, regardless of what they'd done, deserved competent representation and the presumption of a salvageable future. But even she felt the courtroom's temperature drop when Noah smiled at Eli's mother, felt the collective judgment shift in a way that no amount of expert testimony about adolescent brain development could fully counteract. She leaned closer to her client, her whisper urgent and maternal. "Do not look at them. Do not smile. Do not move unless I tell you to." Noah nodded, but his expression suggested compliance born of strategy rather than understanding, the look of someone playing along because the level required it, not because the game had fundamentally changed. He folded his hands again, tilted his head at an angle that might photograph as contrite, and waited for the next scene to begin. The prosecutor organized his files with the calm efficiency of someone who had already won in his mind and simply needed the jury to catch up to the inevitable. Miguel Soria had learned early in his career that the most effective arguments weren't delivered through raised voices or theatrical gestures, but through the patient accumulation of facts that built a narrative so airtight that doubt suffocated under its weight. He had a doorbell camera video that showed Noah following Eli toward the Greenbelt path, and the same camera showing Noah returning alone 43 minutes later, walking faster, glancing over his shoulder, adjusting something bulky under his jacket. He had phone records showing deletion attempts in the hours after Eli's body was discovered, He had a recovered message that Noah thought he'd erased forever, a digital confession written in the careless language of a boy who believed technology obeyed the same rules as a diary hidden under a mattress. And he had that smile, not as evidence of guilt in the legal sense, but as proof of something deeper and more disturbing. The absence of the empathy that separates human beings from the monsters we tell children don't exist. Before the proceedings could continue, before witnesses would be called and evidence submitted and legal arguments refined into weapons, the courtroom experienced a moment of collective understanding that transcended the formal boundaries of justice. Everyone present, from the court reporter whose fingers hovered over keys to the security officer standing by the door to the handful of journalists sketching the scene because cameras weren't allowed, recognized that they were witnessing something rare and terrible. A child who had not yet learned to fake remorse convincingly, who still believed that charm and youth could substitute for accountability, who had killed his best friend and then smiled at the funeral because he genuinely didn't understand why that was wrong. The evidence would prove what Noah did. But that smile had already proven who he was. And in a system built on the premise that punishment should be proportional and that children deserve second chances, the courtroom was about to grapple with a question that had no comfortable answer. What do you do with a 13-year-old who looks at grief and sees only an audience? Briar Glen existed in that peculiar American space between suburb and small town, a place where strip malls shared zip codes with family farms, where new housing developments with names like Meadow Ridge and Willow Creek Estates pressed against land that still remembered what it was before bulldozers arrived. The population hovered around 18,000, small enough that high school football games felt like civic holidays, large enough that you could go weeks without seeing the same face twice at the grocery store. It was the kind of community that appeared in real estate brochures under headers like Safe Haven and Family Friendly, where crime statistics stayed low enough to be boring and the police blotter read like a comedy of minor infractions. Noise complaints, lost dogs, teenagers caught drinking in the park after curfew. Parents moved here specifically because it felt insulated from the chaos that dominated cable news, because children could still ride bikes in looping packs through cul-de-sacs, because stranger danger seemed like paranoia imported from bigger, scarier cities. The Greenbelt drainage path that cut through the heart of several subdivisions was a beloved feature, a ribbon of semi-wild space where kids went to feel momentarily unsupervised, where couples walked dogs at sunset, where the illusion of nature provided cover for the awkward conversations teenagers needed to have away from parental eyes. Eli Harper was Briar Glen distilled into human form, a boy so thoroughly ordinary that his ordinariness felt like a kind of grace, a reminder that goodness didn't require exceptional intelligence or athletic talent or charismatic charm. He was 13 years old, still growing into limbs that seemed to lengthen faster than his coordination could accommodate, with a smile that showed too much gum and a habit of pushing his hair out of his eyes every 30 seconds because he refused to get it cut despite his mother's gentle nagging. His room was a museum of childhood in transition, posters of video game characters sharing wall space with a periodic table from science class. Action figures arranged on shelves next to books. He was finally old enough to understand. A desk buried under homework he attacked with dutiful competence rather than brilliance. Teachers described him as solid, never the first hand raised, never the class clown, never the problem that required intervention. He turned in assignments on time, helped classmates who struggled with math, and possessed the rare gift of making people feel comfortable simply by being near him, like an emotional thermostat that automatically adjusted room temperature toward calm. His relationship with his family was the kind that seemed unremarkable until it was gone, built on rituals so small they barely registered as love until you tried to imagine life without them. Every morning, Eli lined his shoes up by the front door. Left shoe, right shoe, are perfectly parallel, a tiny act of consideration so his mother wouldn't trip over them in the dark. He texted her okay with a thumbs-up emoji whenever he arrived somewhere, not because she demanded it, but because he understood she worried, and reducing her worry cost him nothing. On Sundays, he made breakfast with his father, scrambled eggs that were always slightly overcooked, toast burned at the edges, and they ate together while discussing nothing important, just the pleasant static of people who didn't need conversation to have weight. His little sister, Emma, received folded notes in her lunchbox several times a week, terrible jokes copied from the internet, stick figure drawings, once an elaborate treasure map that led to a candy bar hidden in her backpack. She pretended to find them annoying, rolling her eyes with the performative disdain of younger siblings everywhere, but she kept every single one in a shoebox under her bed, and after Eli died, that box would become the thing she grabbed first during fire drills, the archive of a brother who understood that love could be expressed in bad puns and smuggled chocolate. Eli and Noah's friendship had the origin story of most childhood bonds: random assignment that calcified into routine, proximity that became intimacy through sheer repetition of shared experience. They met in 5th grade when a teacher paired them for a science project neither boy cared about, and they discovered they both played the same online games, both loved a specific YouTube channel, both found the same classmates' try-hard earnestness hilarious. Sleepovers became frequent events. 2 boys sprawled on basement couches surrounded by pizza boxes and soda cans, controllers in hand, trash-talking each other with the casual cruelty that passes for affection among adolescent males. Marissa Harper remembered Noah as polite in those early days, the kind of kid who said thank you when handed snacks and helped carry sleeping bags to the car without being asked. But she also remembered something else, a detail that only gained significance later: the way Noah's eyes would track Eli's movements around a room, the way he positioned himself to always be in Eli's sightline, the way his mood would visibly darken if Eli paid attention to another friend for too long. At the time, it read as attachment, maybe even devotion. In hindsight, it looked like surveillance, like ownership. I'd like the early reconnaissance of someone mapping the boundaries of what they believed they controlled. Over the 2 years that followed, small warnings accumulated like sediment, individually insignificant, collectively ominous. Other kids began finding excuses to avoid Noah, not because of any single dramatic incident, but because of a pattern of behavior that made interactions feel exhausting and vaguely unsafe. He recorded conversations without permission, then played them back to humiliate people who'd trusted him. He kept meticulous track of social debts, who owed him favors, who had slighted him, who needed to be reminded of their place in the hierarchy he was constantly constructing in his mind. When he told jokes, they had edges designed to cut, and if someone objected, he'd deploy the universal shield of bullies everywhere. "I'm just kidding. Why are you so sensitive?" Teachers noticed he struggled with group work, not because he couldn't cooperate, but because he needed to dominate, turning every collaborative project into a referendum on his authority. Parents noticed their children stopped mentioning Noah's name, stopped extending invitations, stopped including him in the organic social metabolism of adolescence. But Eli stayed loyal, making excuses with the patience of someone who believed friendship was a covenant you didn't abandon just because it got difficult, who thought his presence might be the anchor that kept Noah from drifting into something worse. The week before Eli died, something shifted in the precarious ecosystem of middle school social dynamics. A rumor started circulating, one of those vicious little stories that teenagers deploy like biological weapons, designed to humiliate and exclude. The details were adolescent and stupid. Something about Noah crying in a bathroom, or texting a girl who screenshot his messages and shared them, or being caught in a lie that made him look weak in front of people whose opinions he'd spent months trying to control. In the group chats that functioned as the real social infrastructure of 8th grade, Noah's name became a punchline, accompanied by laughing emojis and screenshots that spread with the viral efficiency of cruelty. Eli didn't participate in the mockery, but he also didn't defend Noah publicly, didn't risk his own social capital to stop the bleeding, and in Noah's mental accounting, silence was complicity, neutrality was betrayal. So he began composing lists in a notes app on his phone: allies, enemies, witnesses, traitors. Eli's name migrated between categories, settling finally in a space Noah labeled simply problem. And once something became a problem in Noah's taxonomy of the world, it required a solution. On Saturday morning, Noah sent Eli a message that looked like an olive branch, an attempt at reconciliation wrapped in the language boys use when they're too emotionally inarticulate to say, "I'm hurt," directly. He wrote that they needed to talk for real, no bullshit, that things had gotten messed up and he wanted to clear the air. He suggested the Greenbelt Path as a meeting spot, halfway between their houses, neutral territory, the kind of place they'd hung out 100 times before. Eli responded within minutes, now relief evident in the speed of his reply and the tone of his messages. "Yeah, definitely. I hate when things are weird. 4:30 work?" Noah confirmed the time, then added a detail that seemed casual but wasn't. "Come alone. Easier to talk without people around." Eli agreed without hesitation, because in his understanding of the world, alone meant private, meant safe, meant two friends working through normal adolescent friction without the performance anxiety of an audience. He had no framework for understanding that Noah had chosen isolation as strategy, that privacy was being weaponized, that the boy he'd shared hundreds of hours with had spent the last week planning something Eli's imagination was too innocent to conceive. At 4:15 that afternoon, Eli told his mother he was meeting Noah, grabbed his phone and his house key, and walked out the door into sunlight that seemed as ordinary and safe as every other spring day Briar Glen had ever produced. The Greenbelt Path waited, patient and empty, ready to become the place where childhood ended and evidence began. The first call came in at 6:47 p.m., just as the spring sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the Greenbelt Path that made every bush and tree look vaguely sinister in the fading light. A jogger, a 32-year-old nurse named Patricia Caldwell, who ran the same 3-mile loop 4 evenings a week, had spotted something that didn't belong in the landscape of familiar landmarks she'd memorized through repetition. At first, she thought it was a jacket someone had dropped, maybe a backpack abandoned by teenagers who'd been drinking in the woods and fled when they heard approaching footsteps. But as she slowed her pace and moved closer, the shape resolved into something that made her breath catch in her throat and her hand fumble for the phone strapped to her arm. It was a shoe, a white sneaker with blue trim, the kind every middle schooler seemed to wear. But it was positioned wrong, angled in a way that suggested it hadn't been casually discarded but had come off during struggle or collapse. Patricia stopped running entirely, her athletic training overridden by an instinct that screamed danger. And when she took 3 more steps and pushed aside the tall grass near the drainage culvert, she saw what would later appear in her nightmares with photographic clarity. A boy's body, small and impossibly still, he lying in the kind of position no living person would voluntarily maintain. The first patrol unit arrived within 6 minutes. 2 officers who'd spent most of their shift dealing with a fender bender and a noise complaint, suddenly thrust into the kind of scene that transforms routine public service into career-defining trauma. Officer Marcus Webb approached first, his flashlight cutting white tunnels through the gathering dusk, illuminating details in fragments. The pale skin of a forearm, the dark stain spreading across a T-shirt, the unnatural angle of a neck that spoke to violence rather than accident. He keyed his radio and called for backup, his voice carrying the forced calm of someone whose training was fighting against human horror. And then he knelt beside the body to perform the check he already knew was futile. His partner Officer Dana Reeves had begun securing the perimeter immediately, unspooling yellow crime scene tape between trees and posts, creating a boundary between the ordinary world where joggers ran and children played, and this new territory where evidence would be cataloged and photographed and analyzed until every blade of grass became a potential witness. A paramedic arrived 12 minutes later, running from the ambulance with equipment that wouldn't be needed, and after a brief examination that consisted mostly of gentle touches and professional observation, she leaned back on her heels and shook her head with the smallest, saddest motion, a gesture that confirmed what everyone already knew but needed official documentation to make real. The crime scene began to accumulate the architecture of investigation with practiced efficiency. Portable lights on tall stands bathing everything in artificial brightness that made colors look wrong and shadows disappear into sharp edges. Numbered evidence markers sprouting like yellow flowers wherever something potentially significant caught an investigator's attention. A photographer moving in careful patterns to capture wide angles and close-ups and medium shots that would later be assembled into a visual narrative. The responding supervisor, Sergeant Ellen Kowalski, noted details in a leather-bound notebook with handwriting that looked almost elegant despite the circumstances. 2 sets of shoe impressions visible in the soft mud near the drainage lip. 1 set deeper and more defined, suggesting someone heavier or moving with force. The other lighter and chaotic, suggesting stumbling or struggle. There was no rain in the forecast to wash them away. No crowd yet to contaminate them, just clean evidence waiting to be documented before weather or curiosity destroyed it. A crime scene technician photographed the impressions from multiple angles, then carefully constructed plaster casts that would later be compared against every shoe in Noah Klein's closet, creating a forensic timeline that couldn't be argued with or explained away through teenage charm. The medical examiner arrived as full darkness settled over Briar Glen, transforming the Greenbelt from a neighborhood amenity into a stage lit for tragedy, visible from nearby houses where residents gathered on porches and in yards. Watching the light show and whispering theories that tried to make sense of police activity in a place that was supposed to be safe. Dr. Raymond Voss moved with the unhurried precision of someone who'd learned early in his career that the dead required patience and thoroughness rather than speed, that rushing examination helped nobody and potentially destroyed evidence that might mean the difference between justice and mystery. His preliminary observations were delivered in the clinical language that allowed professionals to discuss horror without drowning in it. Signs of close-range trauma, positioning consistent with collapse rather than post-mortem arrangement, body temperature, and rigor suggesting death had occurred within the last 2 to 4 hours. He noted defensive marks on the victim's hands, small abrasions and bruising that told a story of someone trying to protect themselves, trying to push away danger, trying in the final moments to survive something their brain couldn't fully process as real. The conclusion wasn't spoken loudly, wasn't delivered with dramatic emphasis, but it spread through the assembled officers and technicians like cold water. This wasn't an accident, wasn't a fall or medical emergency or tragic misunderstanding. This was intentional harm delivered by someone who'd made a choice. The family notification fell to Officers Webb and Reeves, a task that felt exponentially harder than securing crime scenes or chasing suspects because it required delivering information that would permanently divide someone's life into before and after. They drove to the Harper house in silence, both mentally rehearsing the script they'd been taught at the academy. Scripts that sounded reasonable in training rooms but felt inadequate when standing on a porch watching a mother's face change as she understood why police were at her door after dark. Marissa Harper had been cooking dinner, had been moving through the familiar choreography of family evening routines when the doorbell rang with a sound that seemed louder and more ominous than usual. She opened the door already knowing something was wrong, because police don't make courtesy calls, because her son hadn't answered her last 3 texts, because somewhere beneath conscious thought, a mother's instinct was already screaming warnings her rational mind refused to hear. Officer Reeves spoke the words slowly and clearly, each syllable carefully enunciated as though precision might somehow soften the impact. "Mrs. Harper, I'm very sorry to inform you that we found your son Eli this evening. He's deceased." The kitchen light behind Marissa was too bright, casting her face in harsh relief as understanding moved across her features in stages. Confusion, denial, comprehension, and finally a collapse that wasn't physical but spiritual. The sound that came from her throat belonging to a place beyond language, where grief and rage and disbelief merged into something primal and terrible. Within an hour, the neighborhood had transformed into the familiar chaos of community tragedy. People gathering in driveways and on sidewalks, rumors spreading faster than facts, theories multiplying to fill the vacuum left by official silence. Someone said they'd heard Eli was meeting a friend. Someone else mentioned the Greenbelt had always felt creepy after dark. A third voice suggested maybe it was a stranger, some drifter passing through, because the alternative, that danger could come from within their safe suburban bubble, was too frightening to consider seriously. Detectives canvassing nearby houses for witnesses and security footage learned quickly that Eli had last been seen heading toward the Greenbelt around 4:30, and when they asked who he'd been planning to meet, the same name surfaced repeatedly: Noah Klein, his best friend, the boy who was practically family. The phrase best friend was repeated like a protective charm, as though saying it enough times could create a force field around the possibility that friendship might be camouflage for something darker. A classmate told Detective Kara Voss, a 12-year veteran with sharp eyes and a reputation for patience, that Noah had seemed totally normal earlier that day, maybe even in a good mood, which struck Voss as worth noting because good moods before bad events sometimes indicated planning, anticipation, the emotional elevation that comes from believing you're about to solve a problem permanently. As volunteer search efforts organized, neighbors grabbing flashlights and forming lines to sweep areas the police hadn't yet cleared, operating under the mistaken belief that perhaps Eli was injured somewhere, perhaps there was still hope. Noah Klein appeared at the edge of the crime scene perimeter with his mother, his face arranged in an expression that approximated concern and shock. He moved through the crowd accepting hugs, patting backs, repeating phrases like, "This is crazy," and "I can't believe it," with the consistency of someone who'd rehearsed their lines. Detective Voss watched him from her position near the command center, noting details in the small spiral notebook she carried everywhere. The way Noah's eyes scanned faces rather than focusing on the direction of the crime scene itself. The way his expression seemed slightly delayed, as though he was remembering to perform emotions rather than experiencing them organically. Yet the micro-expression that flickered across his face when someone said Eli's name, something that looked less like grief and more like satisfaction before he caught himself and rearranged his features into something more appropriate. She made a note in clean block letters: "Effect inconsistent. Monitor closely." And then she watched as Noah's mother pulled him away from the crowd, heading home while other families stayed to bear witness, and Voss noticed one more detail worth documenting. Noah glanced back at the crime scene lights once, and for just a moment the mask slipped entirely, replaced by an expression that looked disturbingly like pride, like an artist checking to see if people appreciated his work. Detective Kara Voss arrived at the police station at 5:43 a.m. on Sunday morning, 3 hours before her official shift began, and roughly 11 hours after Eli Harper's body was discovered, because homicide investigations measured time differently than normal life. The first 48 hours were critical. Witnesses' memories degraded exponentially with each passing day, and evidence had a way of disappearing if you waited for convenient business hours to pursue it. She claimed a conference room on the second floor, covering one entire wall with butcher paper that she divided into columns: timeline, physical evidence, digital evidence, witnesses, inconsistencies. In the center, she taped a school photo of Eli that his mother had provided, Not the crime scene images that would haunt her professionally, but the smiling boy who'd existed before Saturday afternoon. Because solving cases required remembering that bodies were people first. Next to Eli's photo, she placed one of Noah Klein pulled from social media. 13 years old, blonde hair styled with the careful casualness teenagers spent hours achieving, wearing a smirk that now looked less like confidence and more like a preview of courtroom behavior yet to come. The whiteboard became her obsession and her congregation, the place she returned between interviews and evidence reviews, adding details in different colored markers that created a visual map of truth emerging from chaos. The canvassing operation began at first light, with 6 officers working a grid pattern through the neighborhoods surrounding the Greenbelt, knocking on doors and asking variations of the same questions. Did you see anything unusual Saturday afternoon? Do you have security cameras, doorbell systems, garage monitors, anything that might have captured street or sidewalk activity? The results were initially discouraging in their ordinariness. Grainy footage of mail carriers and delivery drivers, kids on bikes moving in packs, dogs being walked, cars passing at speeds that suggested people lived there rather than cruising with criminal intent. Then Officer Martinez knocked on the door of Harold Chen, a retired software engineer who'd installed a comprehensive home security system not out of fear but out of enthusiasm for technology. The kind of person who monitored his property the way other people watched sports. Chen's doorbell camera faced the sidewalk that led to the Greenbelt entrance, 2 houses down. And he'd configured it to record continuously, rather than just on motion activation, because storage was cheap and you never knew what might prove interesting later. He handed Martinez a USB drive containing Saturday's footage with the casual generosity of someone who had no idea he was about to become a crucial witness in a homicide prosecution. Voss watched the footage 3 times before allowing herself to believe what she was seeing, because good evidence felt too much like luck, and luck made detectives suspicious. Timestamp 4:12 p.m. Eli Harper appeared walking along the sidewalk toward the Greenbelt, his gait loose and unhurried, phone visible in his right hand, earbuds trailing white cords to his ears, and a boy moving through his neighborhood with the easy confidence of someone who'd walked this path 100 times before and expected to walk it 100 times more. Timestamp 4:18 p.m. Noah Klein entered the frame from the opposite direction, walking faster, hood pulled up despite the warm spring weather, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets in a way that created bulky silhouettes suggesting he was carrying something. He didn't call out to Eli or wave. He simply fell into step behind him, matching his pace but maintaining distance, and together they disappeared down the path toward the drainage area where the camera's angle couldn't follow. Then came the footage that would later be replayed for a jury until every frame was seared into collective memory. Timestamp 5:02 p.m. Noah reappeared walking alone, now moving significantly faster than before, his head swiveling to glance behind him twice, his right hand adjusting something at his waistband that created a bulk under his jacket that hadn't been visible in the earlier footage. While the doorbell camera was providing visual confirmation of Noah's presence, a separate team was extracting data from Eli's phone, recovered near his body with a spider-webbed screen, but an intact memory that surrendered its secrets to forensic software. The message history between Eli and Noah painted a picture of their final communication. Eli's tentative, "Are you mad?" sent Friday night, Noah's response delayed by several hours. "Just come, no drama," followed by the Saturday coordination of time and place. What struck the analysts as significant was what came after the meeting was arranged. Silence. Not the comfortable silence of friends who talk later, but the absolute void where normally there would be memes, game invitations, random observations that constituted the background radiation of teenage friendship. Eli had sent one final message at 4:24 p.m., 12 minutes after the camera showed him heading toward the Greenbelt. "Here, where are you?" No response from Noah. The location data from Eli's phone showed it stopped moving at 4:31 p.m. near the drainage bend coordinates. It never moved again. Noah's phone, by contrast, showed continued activity. A ping from his home Wi-Fi network at 5:19 p.m., followed by internet connectivity, followed by something the digital forensics team found particularly damning: cleared browser cache, deleted message threads, and search history that had been manually wiped rather than simply aging out of the system's automatic retention period. The physical evidence began organizing itself into a narrative that corroborated the digital timeline with the kind of redundancy that prosecutors dream about and defense attorneys have nightmares over. Crime scene technicians had documented shoe impressions at the scene, and now they began the painstaking work of comparison, matching tread patterns against databases of commercial footwear, measuring size and wear characteristics, looking for distinctive features that could narrow possibilities from thousands to one. One set of impressions matched a common athletic shoe brand, nothing remarkable there, except for a specific wear pattern on the heel, a missing rubber segment about the size of a dime where the tread had apparently been damaged and never repaired. The technicians pulled every piece of social media they could find featuring Noah Klein, scrolling through photos and videos looking for clear shots of his feet. And there it was in a TikTok video posted 8 days before Eli's death. Noah visible in the background of a friend's clip, wearing shoes that matched the brand and model, and when the forensic image analyst zoomed in and enhanced the resolution, there was the same distinctive heel damage, a defect unique enough to make the impression comparison legally defensible. Meanwhile, a different lab technician examining debris collected from the crime scene had found microscopic traces of adhesive residue on vegetation near where Eli's body was discovered. The chemical signature consistent with duct tape or similar binding material, suggesting restraint or an attempt to control the victim that had been cleaned up but not perfectly. Detective Voss scheduled Noah's first formal interview for Monday morning, allowing 48 hours between the crime and the conversation, enough time for evidence to accumulate, but not so much that lawyers would have time to construct elaborate defensive strategies. Noah arrived with his mother, Jennifer Klein, a slim woman with the exhausted eyes of someone who'd spent Sunday night cycling between disbelief and dread, and his initial demeanor was performatively helpful. Of the tone of someone who'd watched enough police shows to know that cooperative witnesses sit forward and make eye contact and volunteer information without being asked. He talked rapidly about how much he loved Eli, how they were basically brothers, how he couldn't imagine who would hurt someone so gentle and kind. When Voss asked him to walk through Saturday afternoon, Noah provided a timeline that sounded rehearsed in its precision. They'd met at the Greenbelt around 4:30, talked for maybe 20 minutes about school stuff and drama, and then Noah had left because he had to be home for dinner. Voss nodded, made notes, asked follow-up questions that seemed casual but were actually tripwires testing consistency. She asked what they'd talked about specifically. Noah's answer was vague, mentioning people being fake and rumors without details. She asked what Eli had been wearing. Noah described a blue hoodie when in fact Eli had been wearing a gray t-shirt. And then Voss asked the question that mattered. "What time did you leave?" Noah answered without hesitation. 4:30, maybe 4:35. He said it with the confidence of someone who believed precision made lies more credible. The interview room went quiet for a moment, while Voss appeared to consult her notes, a theatrical pause that was actually her deciding how much to reveal and how much to hold back. She slid a photograph across the table, a still frame pulled from Harold Chen's doorbell camera, timestamp clearly visible at 5:02 p.m., showing Noah walking alone away from the Greenbelt area. She didn't accuse, didn't raise her voice, and simply asked him to help her understand the discrepancy between his stated departure time and what the camera recorded. Noah's face went through a progression of expressions faster than his brain could regulate them. Surprise, calculation, defensiveness, and finally a smile, small and reflexive, as though he'd just been challenged to a game he found exciting rather than confronting evidence of potential murder. He said the timestamp must be wrong, that those cheap doorbell cameras were notoriously inaccurate, or maybe that wasn't even him in the footage because lots of kids wore similar clothes. Voss asked if he'd mind showing her his shoes. The question landed like a physical blow. Noah's mother inhaled sharply, understanding implications before her son did, and Noah himself hesitated for 3 full seconds before complying, because refusing would look guilty, but complying meant surrendering potential evidence. He untied his sneakers slowly, making a joke about his socks having holes, and handed them across the table, where Voss photographed them from multiple angles, zooming in on the heel where a distinctive segment of tread was missing. A damage pattern that would later match the crime scene impressions with statistical probability high enough to satisfy courts and devastate reasonable doubt. The warrant for Noah Klein's electronic devices was signed by Judge Patricia Moreno at 2:17 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon, 72 hours after Eli Harper's body was discovered. The probable cause affidavit running to 11 pages of meticulously documented discrepancies between Noah's statements and the evidence already collected. Detective Voss delivered the warrant to the Klein residence herself, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers and a digital forensics specialist named Marcus Trent, who carried the kind of equipment that looked expensive and vaguely intimidating. Faraday bags to prevent remote wiping, write-blocking hardware to preserve data integrity, documentation forms that would establish chain of custody stringent enough to survive appellate scrutiny. Jennifer Klein opened the door already crying, her face puffy and exhausted from 3 nights of broken sleep and dawning realization, and she didn't resist or argue when Voss explained they'd be seizing Noah's phone, laptop, tablet, and any gaming systems with communication capabilities. Noah watched from the top of the stairs, arms crossed, a face arranged in an expression of theatrical boredom that didn't quite hide the tension in his shoulders or the way his eyes tracked the Faraday bag containing his phone, like he was watching someone walk away with a piece of his identity. The extraction process took 16 hours spread across 3 days, not because the devices were particularly sophisticated, but because thoroughness mattered more than speed, and because deleted data required specialized recovery techniques that couldn't be rushed without risking corruption. Marcus Trent worked in a windowless lab in the basement of the police station, surrounded by screens displaying hex code and file trees and metadata that told stories their creators thought they'd erased. Modern teenagers generated astonishing volumes of digital communication, texts, social media messages, gaming chat logs, photo metadata, browser histories that mapped their interests and anxieties and secrets with anthropological precision. Noah's devices painted a portrait of a boy obsessed with status and control, someone who curated his online presence with the calculated intensity of a politician managing public image, who maintained different personas for different audiences, who saved screenshots of conversations as leverage and ammunition for future conflicts. But what interested Trent most was what Noah had tried to erase. On Saturday night between 11:04 p.m. and 11:47 p.m., Noah's phone showed a flurry of deletion activity. Message threads removed, photos moved to recently deleted folders, browser history cleared, app caches wiped. It was panicked house cleaning performed by someone who understood technology just enough to think he could cover his tracks, but not enough to realize that deletion was rarely permanent. The breakthrough came from an unexpected angle, a reminder that teenagers' understanding of technology was simultaneously sophisticated and naive, fluent in interfaces but ignorant of infrastructure. Noah had used a messaging app popular among his peer group, one that advertised end-to-end encryption and disappearing messages as features designed to protect privacy. What Noah didn't understand What most users didn't understand was that when messages were sent to someone whose phone automatically backed up to cloud storage, copies persisted in those backups even after the original sender deleted them. A classmate named Tyler Rodriguez had received messages from Noah on Saturday night, messages that seemed weird and unsettling enough that Tyler had mentioned them to his father on Sunday morning after hearing about Eli's death. Tyler's father, an IT professional with enough technical knowledge to take digital evidence seriously, had preserved his son's phone without touching it and contacted police Monday afternoon. When forensic analysts extracted Tyler's cloud backup, they found a conversation that Noah Klein thought had been erased from existence forever. Saturday, 11:16 p.m., Noah to Tyler. "He won't talk shit again." Tyler's response, "WTF are you talking about?" Noah, "Don't tell, they can't prove it." Tyler, "Dude, this isn't funny." Noah's final message was just an emoji, a laughing face, sent at 11:19 p.m. 3 hours after he'd participated in the community search effort, 4 hours after he'd hugged Eli's mother and told her he hoped they'd find her son safe. Detective Voss read the recovered messages 3 times, then walked to the coffee machine and poured a cup she didn't drink, needing the ritual of movement to process what she was looking at. The messages weren't a detailed confession. They were better than a confession because they revealed psychology, showed consciousness of guilt, demonstrated the gap between Noah's public performance of grief and his private satisfaction with what he'd done. "They can't prove it" was particularly damning, the phrase that separated childish bravado from calculated criminal thinking, because it meant Noah understood he'd done something requiring proof, something that would need to be proven to matter. Voss assembled her team in the conference room and walked them through the evidence chronologically. Doorbell footage placing Noah at the scene, timeline inconsistencies destroying his alibi, shoe impressions matching his distinctive wear pattern, deletion activity showing consciousness of guilt, and now a message that was as close to a confession as prosecutors could hope for without actual video of the crime itself. The next step was clear. They had enough for an arrest, enough to charge, enough to take a 13-year-old boy into custody and transform him from witness to suspect to defendant. The decision to arrest a child was never easy, carried weight that went beyond legal procedure into moral territory that made even veteran detectives uncomfortable. But Voss had learned early in her career that age didn't prevent someone from making monstrous choices, and protecting the community sometimes meant acknowledging that monsters could have braces and book reports due on Monday. The physical evidence team had been working parallel to the digital investigation, and their findings added structural support to the narrative being constructed. A search of the Klein home under the same warrant that seized Noah's devices had produced several items of interest: muddy socks in a laundry hamper in Noah's room, the mud composition consistent with soil samples from the Greenbelt drainage area, a dark hoodie hanging in his closet containing plant material embedded in the fabric seams, a botanical analysis identifying the fragments as seed pods from a shrub species that grew densely in one specific area of the Greenbelt, the area where Eli's body was found. Additionally, investigators had documented a firearm stored in a biometric safe in the master bedroom, a 9mm handgun that Noah's father insisted was secured and inaccessible. But when detectives interviewed Noah's younger brother separately, the 10-year-old mentioned that Noah had figured out the safe code months ago by watching their father's finger movements, had shown it to him once as proof that parents weren't as smart as they thought. Ballistic analysis would later confirm that the projectile recovered during Eli's autopsy matched the class characteristics and microscopic markings of test fires from that specific weapon, establishing not just that a gun was involved, but that it was this gun from this house, accessible to this boy who'd claimed friendship while planning murder. Detective Voss brought Noah in for a second interview on Wednesday afternoon, this time with his attorney present. Jennifer Klein had hired Lena Park after the warrant execution, finally accepting that her son needed more than maternal belief, in his innocence. The interview room felt different with Park there, her presence changing the dynamic from interrogation to negotiation, her yellow legal pad already covered with notes and objections she'd raise if Voss overstepped boundaries. Voss didn't overstep. She simply presented evidence in careful sequence. The doorbell footage, the Wi-Fi connection logs showing Noah's phone at home when he claimed to still be with Eli. Now the shoe impression comparisons, and finally the recovered messages. She slid printed copies across the table, the words looking starker and more damning on paper than they'd appeared on screens. "He won't talk shit again. Don't tell. They can't prove it." Noah read them without visible emotion, then looked up at Voss with an expression that was part defiance and part calculation, like a poker player deciding whether to fold or bluff bigger. He said the messages were just lyrics, that Tyler misunderstood the context, that people texted stupid things all the time without meaning them literally. When Voss asked why he'd deleted the conversation if it was meaningless, Noah shrugged and said he deleted stuff all the time to free up storage space. When she asked why he'd told Tyler they can't prove it, Noah's answer revealed more than he intended. Because everyone always assumes the worst, because people lie and make stuff up, because you can't trust anyone. It was projection so transparent that Lena Park actually closed her eyes for a moment, recognizing that her client was incriminating himself faster than she could interrupt. The smile returned during that second interview, flickering across Noah's face at moments that made clear it wasn't nervousness or misunderstood social cues. It was something darker, a reflex that surfaced when he felt challenged or cornered, when his control over the narrative was slipping and his instinct was to reassert dominance through the only means available, refusing to give adults the reaction they expected. When Voss pointed out the impossibility of his timeline, he couldn't have left the Greenbelt at 4:30 and arrived home in time to generate a Wi-Fi connection log at 5:19 unless he developed teleportation abilities. Noah smiled and suggested maybe he'd run. Maybe he was faster than people thought. When she asked why he'd searched "How long until police can track deleted texts" at 1:04 a.m. Sunday morning, he smiled again and said he was curious about technology, that he liked learning how things worked. His mother started crying at some point during the interview, quiet tears that she wiped away with shaking hands, and when Noah glanced at her, his expression shifted to irritation rather than concern, as though her emotional display was embarrassing him in front of an audience. Lena Park called for a break, pulled Noah aside, and had a whispered conversation intense enough that Noah's face went red and his jaw clenched. But when they returned to the table, he'd regained his composure, the smile tucked away temporarily, replaced by blank neutrality that was somehow worse because it felt rehearsed, performative, a mask he wore when his authentic reactions kept betraying him. Detective Voss ended the interview by informing Noah and his attorney that charges would be filed. The specific counts and whether they'd pursue adult certification would be determined by the prosecutor's office, but the evidence supported charges of first-degree murder, and he should prepare himself for what came next. Noah absorbed this information with a slight nod, as though she'd just told him about homework due dates rather than the potential end of his childhood and freedom. As he stood to leave, Voss watched his body language carefully, cataloging details the way she'd been trained. The way he checked his reflection in the one-way mirror and adjusted his hair, the way he scanned the hallway as they escorted him out looking for cameras or witnesses, the way he turned back once to look at Voss with an expression that wasn't fear or regret, but something closer to curiosity, like he was wondering what she'd do next, like this was all still a game whose rules he was learning as he went. In the hallway outside the interview room, Lena Park stood with her hand pressed against the wall, taking deep breaths, and when another detective asked if she was all right, she said something that would stay with everyone who heard it. "I've defended killers before, but I've never defended someone who seemed disappointed that killing didn't solve his problem." The conference room whiteboard had accumulated so much information that it looked like a spider's web, every thread connecting back to Noah Klein standing at the center, and Detective Voss added one final note in red marker at the bottom. Arrest authorization requested. The message he thought was gone had become the words that would follow him into courtrooms, into deliberations, into the permanent record of who he'd proven himself to be when he thought nobody was watching. The psychological profile of Noah Klein began accumulating long before experts were retained to testify about brain development and impulse control, assembled instead from the observational data that teachers, counselors, and classmates had been generating for years without recognizing they were documenting the evolution of something dangerous. The prosecution's case wouldn't rely on amateur psychology or armchair diagnosis. Courts were appropriately skeptical of retroactive pattern finding that made every difficult child look like a nascent criminal. But understanding who Noah was required looking at behavior rather than labels, at choices rather than speculation about internal states. What emerged from interviews and records was a portrait of a boy who'd learned early that emotions were tools for manipulating others rather than authentic experiences to be shared, who treated relationships as transactions where loyalty was currency and betrayal justified retaliation, who seemed to experience other people not as fully human, but as supporting characters in a narrative where he was always the protagonist whose needs mattered most. It wasn't that Noah lacked intelligence or charm. He possessed both in quantities that made him effective at short-term social manipulation. But he seemed to lack the foundational empathy that prevents most people from crossing certain lines. The visceral understanding that other people's pain matters because they're fundamentally similar to you rather than fundamentally inferior. School records painted a picture of escalating behavioral concerns that administrators had addressed with the tools available to them. Parent conferences, behavioral contracts, are brief counseling interventions without ever quite reaching the level of severity that would trigger more intensive mental health evaluation or alternative placement. A third-grade teacher had noted that Noah struggles with group work, wants to control all decisions, becomes angry when peers don't defer to his ideas. Language that sounded like normal childhood egocentrism until you tracked how the pattern intensified rather than matured over time. A fifth-grade counselor documented that Noah had been caught recording a classmate in the bathroom, and when confronted had shown no apparent understanding of why this violated the other student's privacy, treating the incident as a problem of being caught rather than a problem of what he'd done. By seventh grade, teachers were using carefully coded language that educational professionals recognized as red flags. Lacks remorse when his actions hurt others. Interprets appropriate consequences as personal attacks. Demonstrates a concerning fascination with others' emotional reactions to conflict. None of these observations alone warranted alarm. Adolescence was turbulent for everyone. Emotional regulation developed at different rates, and the line between difficult kid and dangerous kid was hard to draw prospectively. But compiled chronologically, they revealed a child moving in the wrong direction, becoming more rather than less capable of harm as his social sophistication increased. The social dynamics of Noah's peer group provided additional texture to understanding how he operated in environments where adult supervision was minimal and adolescent hierarchies were self-policing. Multiple classmates described a pattern that felt familiar to anyone who'd survived middle school. Noah kept detailed mental accounts of social debts and slights, bringing up months-old incidents as justification for current retaliation, treating normal friendship friction as betrayals requiring punishment. He'd screenshot private conversations and threatened to expose them if people didn't comply with his demands. Nothing criminal exactly, but a use of information as leverage that made interactions feel exhausting and vaguely coercive. One former friend described a sleepover where Noah had filmed another boy sleeping and threatened to post embarrassing footage online, framing it as just a joke when confronted, but using the existence of the video to extract favors for weeks afterward. Another classmate mentioned that Noah maintained a list on his phone, visible briefly when he was showing something else, that ranked people as safe, useful, or problem, a categorization system that suggested he viewed relationships through a purely strategic lens rather than experiencing genuine affection or attachment. These weren't the typical boundary-pushing experiments of adolescence. They were rehearsals for a worldview where other people existed primarily as obstacles or assets, where manipulation was normal and empathy was weakness. His relationship with Eli Harper was particularly revealing when examined through the lens of control rather than friendship, a dynamic that looked like closeness but functioned more like ownership. Classmates described how Noah would monopolize Eli's time, become visibly agitated when Eli made plans with other friends, manufacture situations that required Eli to choose between Noah and others as a loyalty test. Eli had interpreted this behavior through the generous lens of someone raised to be patient with people's flaws, seeing Noah's possessiveness as insecurity that could be soothed through consistent friendship, rather than recognizing it as an escalating need for dominance that no amount of loyalty would ever satisfy. In the weeks before Eli's death, teachers had noticed the friendship seemed strained, Eli looking uncomfortable when Noah approached, choosing seats farther away in classes they shared, spending more time with other friend groups. One teacher had even asked Eli if everything was okay with Noah, and Eli had said something that haunted everyone who heard it later. "He's just going through stuff. He gets intense sometimes. I'm trying to be patient." Eli's patience became the vulnerability Noah exploited, the kindness that made it possible for Noah to isolate him under the guise of reconciliation, because Eli's worldview didn't include the possibility that his best friend might be planning murder while texting about wanting to fix things. The intake evaluation at juvenile detention, conducted within 72 hours of Noah's arrest, saw documented behavior that correctional staff found unsettling enough to flag for both the prosecution and defense teams. Noah had demonstrated what the psychologist termed inappropriate affect during serious discussion, smiling when informed of the charges against him, asking questions about facility amenities that seemed to treat detention like summer camp rather than criminal custody. When the psychologist asked how he felt about Eli's death, Noah said, "Bad, I guess," with the emotional inflection of someone discussing a canceled TV show rather than the loss of his closest friend. When asked to elaborate, Noah's explanation focused entirely on how the situation affected him. People were being unfair, treating him like a criminal when nobody really knows what happened, the news making him look worse than it was, without a single reference to Eli's family, Eli's lost future, or the permanence of death. The psychologist noted this wasn't necessarily evidence of guilt. Trauma and developmental factors could produce emotional blunting that mimicked sociopathy. But it was evidence of something, a data point that would later be weaponized by both sides, prosecutors arguing it revealed Noah's true nature, and defense counsel arguing it revealed a child so developmentally immature that adult prosecution was inappropriate. The family dynamics complicated any simple narrative about where Noah's behavioral patterns originated, because his parents weren't caricatures of neglect or abuse. They were exhausted middle-class adults trying to manage a child who'd always been harder to parent than his younger brother, whose defiance escalated as he got older, who seemed to view rules as challenges rather than boundaries. Jennifer Klein described years of behavioral interventions, reward charts that Noah gamed by technically complying while violating the spirit of expectations, therapy appointments where Noah performed normalcy for 50 minutes while the real problems continued at home, punishments that seemed to make him more covert rather than more compliant. His father, David Klein, admitted in interviews that he'd largely disengaged from discipline because every interaction became a power struggle. He either won temporarily through force of authority or lost in ways that made him feel manipulated by his own child. They'd tried strictness and flexibility, consequences and communication, medication briefly, after a pediatrician suggested ADHD, nothing producing the kind of fundamental shift in Noah's relationship to other people's boundaries that might have prevented this. After the arrest, Jennifer Klein kept saying, "He's just a kid," with the desperation of someone trying to will reality into a different shape, while David said almost nothing, sitting in interviews with his head in his hands like a man cataloging all the moments he'd missed or misinterpreted or rationalized away, because accepting what they meant was too terrible to consider. The prosecution would ultimately argue that Noah's psychology wasn't mitigation, but aggravation, that his pattern of manipulation, his lack of remorse, his treatment of Eli's murder as a problem-solving exercise that merely failed to achieve its goals, all suggested someone who posed ongoing danger regardless of therapeutic intervention or the passage of time. The defense would counter that 13-year-old brains were fundamentally different from adult brains, that impulse control and future-oriented thinking and moral reasoning were all still developing, and that Noah's behaviors could reflect treatable disorders rather than fixed personality traits, that writing off a child as irredeemable at 13 was both scientifically unjustifiable and constitutionally suspect. Both sides would be arguing in good faith about questions that had no comfortable answers. At what age does someone become fully responsible for understanding that murder is wrong? Can someone whose emotional development is stunted by trauma or neurology be rehabilitated into empathy they never organically developed? What does a just society owe a child who commits an adult crime, protection or accountability, treatment or punishment, hope or honest assessment that some damage can't be repaired? These questions would fill hours of expert testimony and legal argument. But for Detective Voss reviewing interview footage late at night, the answer felt simpler and darker. Noah had smiled at Eli's mother not because he didn't understand grief, but because he understood it perfectly and enjoyed being its architect, enjoyed the proof of his power to permanently alter other people's lives while they remained unable to alter his. The smile wasn't immaturity. It was the truest thing about him. The moment when performance dropped away and the emptiness underneath became briefly visible before he remembered to put the mask back on. The juvenile transfer hearing took place in a courtroom designed for adult proceedings, and the mismatch between architecture and defendant created an optical problem that both sides would try to exploit. Noah looked impossibly young sitting at a table built for grown attorneys, his feet barely reaching the floor, his wrists thin enough that the dress shirt his mother had bought for the occasion hung loose around the cuffs. The defense wanted the judge to see exactly this: a child swallowed by systems built for adults, a boy who needed protection rather than prosecution, someone whose youth was so visually obvious that treating him as an adult offender felt absurd on its face. The prosecution wanted the judge to look past the optics to the evidence, to remember that Eli Harper had been exactly the same size, the same age, equally childlike in appearance, but denied the opportunity to grow up because this particular child had decided his former best friend no longer deserved to exist. Judge Elaine Rourke understood both arguments before anyone spoke them aloud, had presided over enough transfer hearings to know that age was simultaneously the most important factor and the most manipulable, that looking young was different from thinking young, that the law required her to consider developmental capacity without allowing it to erase accountability for actions that had permanent consequences. The hearing's atmosphere was different from a trial, less theatrical, more technical, focused on legal standards rather than emotional persuasion, but the underlying tension was just as intense because the outcome would determine everything that followed. If the judge denied transfer and kept Noah in juvenile court, he'd face maximum confinement until age 21, followed by mandatory release. A sentence that would end while he was young enough to build an entirely new life, with a sealed record that most employers and institutions would never access. If she granted transfer to adult court, Noah would face potential life imprisonment with parole eligibility decades away, his childhood becoming a mitigating factor rather than a definitive shield. his future measured in increments so long that the boy sitting in the courtroom today would be elderly before freedom became possible. The standard the judge had to apply was whether Noah was amenable to treatment in the juvenile system and whether public safety required adult prosecution. A balancing test that required her to simultaneously believe in rehabilitation's possibility while honestly assessing its probability for this specific child who'd shown no authentic remorse and significant evidence of calculated cruelty. The prosecution's argument was delivered by ADA Miguel Soria with the methodical precision of someone building a structure one brick at a time, each piece of evidence supporting the weight of the conclusion he wanted the judge to reach. He walked through the planning indicators, Noah selecting an isolated location, insisting Eli come alone, bringing a weapon, returning home to delete evidence rather than calling for help, participating in search efforts while knowing exactly where Eli's body was located. And he emphasized the consciousness of guilt demonstrated by Noah's digital house cleaning and his message to Tyler Rodriguez. They can't prove it. Language that revealed understanding of legal jeopardy and evidential requirements. Sophisticated thinking that contradicted defense claims of impulsive adolescent decision-making. Soria presented the doorbell footage again, asking the judge to focus not on what it showed, but on what Noah had tried to claim. That he'd left at 4:30 when the video proved he'd returned at 5:02, that the camera must be wrong rather than his memory, that maybe it wasn't even him in the footage despite the distinctive shoe wear matching his own. Each lie was presented as evidence of capacity, the ability to construct false narratives, to maintain them under questioning, to deploy them strategically to avoid consequences, all suggesting cognitive sophistication inconsistent with juvenile court's rehabilitative framework designed for impulsive children who acted without understanding implications. Defense counsel Lena Park approached the hearing from a fundamentally different philosophical position, one that acknowledged Noah's actions while insisting his age remained the most legally salient fact, regardless of how mature his planning appeared. She presented expert testimony from Dr. Sarah Castellano, a developmental neuropsychologist who explained with chart-aided precision that adolescent brains, particularly the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control, future planning, and moral reasoning, remained structurally immature until the mid-20s. That 13-year-olds were categorically different from adults in their ability to resist peer pressure, consider long-term consequences, and regulate emotional responses to perceived provocation. Dr. Castellano testified that behaviors that looked like cold calculation in an adult might reflect developmental limitations in a child. The inability to mentally simulate how actions would feel afterward, the tendency to fixate on immediate problems without considering permanent solutions, the literal inability to fully comprehend death's permanence because abstract reasoning was still forming. Park argued that the very sophistication prosecutors cited as evidence of adult-like thinking could equally indicate a child mimicking behaviors he'd seen in media, without understanding their real-world weight, performing what he thought calculated criminals did because adolescent identity was fundamentally performative, built on trying different personas until you figured out which one fit. The hearing's emotional center came when both sides addressed Noah's courtroom demeanor, the smiles that had generated such visceral reactions from observers and would inevitably influence the judge's assessment whether she consciously allowed it or not. The prosecution characterized the smiling as contempt, as evidence that Noah viewed the proceedings as entertainment rather than consequence, that he was treating Eli's family's grief as something amusing or satisfying rather than devastating. They presented testimony from the juvenile detention intake psychologist about Noah's flat effect when discussing Eli's death. His focus on his own inconveniences rather than the victim's permanent absence, his apparent inability or unwillingness to demonstrate remorse that wasn't transparently performative. The defense countered with different expert testimony, suggesting that atypical emotional responses to trauma and stress were common in adolescence. that nervous smiling was a documented phenomenon, that interpreting facial expressions as character evidence was scientifically dubious and prejudicial. Judges were supposed to evaluate evidence, not punish defendants for having faces that made people uncomfortable. Park pointed out that adults found Noah's demeanor disturbing, partly because it violated expectations of how children should look when confronted with serious consequences. But those expectations reflected cultural norms rather than developmental realities. And punishing someone for failing to perform grief adequately was fundamentally unjust, regardless of age. Then came the moment that shifted the hearing's momentum in ways that legal arguments alone couldn't have achieved. The judge called a brief recess, and as observers stood and stretched and Eli's family gathered their belongings to step outside for air, Noah turned in his chair, not toward his attorney or his mother, but toward the gallery where Marissa Harper was standing with her daughter, and smiled again. Not broadly, not theatrically, just a small upward curve of his mouth accompanied by direct eye contact that lasted long enough to ensure she saw it, registered it, understood that it was meant for her specifically. A bailiff noticed immediately. He's stepping closer with a hand drifting toward his equipment, and Judge Rourke, who'd been reviewing notes at the bench, looked up and witnessed the tail end of the exchange. She called counsel to approach the bench for a discussion that observers couldn't hear but could read in the sudden tension of Lena Park's body language and the satisfied set of the prosecutor's shoulders. When court resumed, the judge addressed Noah directly for the first time, her voice carrying the quiet intensity of someone who'd made a decision and wanted to ensure everyone understood both the ruling and the reasoning behind it. Judge Rourke said the court had considered Noah's age and developmental status, had reviewed expert testimony about adolescent brain maturity. I had examined his family history and prior interventions and potential for rehabilitation within juvenile system resources. She said the law required her to treat youth as a significant mitigating factor, to presume that children were more capable of change than adults, to exhaust juvenile options before resorting to adult prosecution. But she also said the law required her to protect community safety, to make honest assessments about amenability to treatment, to recognize that some actions carried such severity and were accompanied by such concerning behavioral patterns that rehabilitation's possibility didn't outweigh its uncertainty. She stated that Noah's actions demonstrated planning, concealment, and consciousness of guilt inconsistent with impulsive immaturity. She noted that his behavior throughout the proceedings, and she emphasized the word throughout, while making eye contact with him, suggested someone who viewed the judicial process not as an opportunity for accountability and growth, but as a challenge to be manipulated through performance. She granted the state's motion to transfer Noah to adult court, explaining that while she desperately hoped the juvenile system could rehabilitate every child who entered it, hoping wasn't the same as believing, and belief required evidence Noah had shown no sign of providing. The gavel came down with a sound that felt heavier than wood striking wood, more like a door closing on childhood itself, and Noah's mother made a sound between a gasp and a sob that carried across the courtroom like something breaking. Noah's reaction to the transfer ruling was perhaps the most revealing moment in a hearing full of significant testimony and legal argument, because for the first time his mask slipped not into a smile, but into genuine emotion. And the emotion was anger rather than fear, indignation rather than remorse, fury at losing control rather than grief about consequences. His face flushed red, his jaw clenched tight enough that the muscles visibly tensed, and he whispered something to Lena Park sharp enough that she physically recoiled slightly before leaning in to respond. He looked at the judge not with the fear appropriate to a child being told his life had fundamentally changed, but with resentment appropriate to someone who believed they'd been cheated, treated unfairly, denied something they'd earned through clever performance. The prosecution team exchanged glances that carefully avoided looking triumphant, because celebrating a child's transfer to adult court felt wrong even when you believed it was necessary. The defense team began immediate conversation about appeal timelines and standards of review and preservation of issues for higher courts. And Eli Harper's family sat in the kind of stunned, exhausted relief that comes from winning a battle that doesn't feel like victory because the war that mattered, keeping their son alive, had been lost before any of them understood a war was being waged. As Noah was led from the courtroom, he glanced back once at the gallery, his eyes scanning faces like he was taking inventory of who'd supported him and who'd failed him. And the expression on his face suggested he was already writing a narrative in which he was the victim of a system too rigid to understand his complexity, too frightened by his intelligence to give him the second chance he deserved, too invested in punishment to recognize that he was just a kid who'd made a mistake. The smile was gone, replaced by something harder and more honest. The face of someone who'd gambled on charm and youth being sufficient armor against consequences, and was just beginning to understand that he'd miscalculated catastrophically. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in late October, 6 months after Eli Harper's death. The courtroom transformed from the site of pretrial hearings into the stage for a proceeding that would determine whether Noah Klein spent his youth in prison or his entire life there. The jury box held 12 adults and 4 alternates, faces reflecting the demographics of the county, teachers and accountants, retirees and small business owners, people who'd survived voir dire. By convincing both sides they could evaluate a child's actions without being paralyzed by either sympathy for his youth or revulsion at his alleged crime. They'd been instructed repeatedly that Noah's age was a factor to consider, but not a reason to ignore evidence. That childhood didn't grant immunity from accountability, but did require careful assessment of intent and capacity. Instructions that sounded clear in the abstract, but would prove agonizingly complicated when applied to actual testimony about actual decisions that had ended an actual life. The gallery was packed with journalists, victim advocates, Eli's extended family, and a handful of Noah's relatives who'd come despite the social cost of visibly supporting someone accused of murdering his best friend, their presence requiring a courage that looked different from innocence because it acknowledged horror while insisting relationship obligations didn't end when they became painful. A D.A. Miguel Soria's opening statement was delivered in the measured tone of someone who trusted evidence more than rhetoric, who'd learned that juries responded better to clear narratives than emotional manipulation, who understood that his job was presenting truth rather than performing outrage. He walked the jury through the relationship between Eli and Noah, emphasizing years of friendship that made what followed not random violence but intimate betrayal, the kind of killing that required proximity and trust, and the victim's willingness to meet alone because the concept of danger from this particular person didn't exist in his mental framework. Soria described the Saturday afternoon when Eli received messages from Noah asking to meet, framing it as reconciliation after a week of social tension. And he asked the jury to remember what it felt like at 13 when friendship dramas consumed your whole emotional world, when repairing a relationship with your best friend felt urgent enough to drop everything and walk to a meeting spot despite approaching dinner time. He explained that 2 boys entered the Greenbelt path that afternoon, but only one emerged. And in the 43 minutes between Noah following Eli into the woods and Noah returning alone, something happened that transformed best friends into victim and killer, transformed an ordinary Saturday into the day Briar Glen learned that monsters could look like children and danger could wear a familiar face. The prosecution's opening emphasized the evidence that would structure the case. Doorbell camera footage that established timeline and opportunity, digital forensics revealing deleted messages and consciousness of guilt, physical evidence linking Noah to the crime scene through shoe impressions and botanical trace material, ballistic analysis connecting the murder weapon to Noah's household, and most damning, Noah's own words sent to Tyler Rodriguez hours after Eli's body was discovered. "He won't talk shit again. They can't prove it." Soria didn't sensationalize, didn't use gruesome details that would inflame rather than inform. didn't ask the jury to hate Noah, but simply to see him clearly as someone who'd made choices that adult or child understood were irreversible and wrong. He concluded by promising the evidence would show premeditation, opportunity, motive rooted in perceived humiliation, and behavior after the crime that demonstrated Noah understood exactly what he'd done and believed he was smart enough to avoid consequences. A miscalculation that would be proven comprehensively through testimony and exhibits that couldn't be explained away through claims of youthful confusion or impulsive mistake. Defense attorney Lena Park approached her opening from a philosophically different position, one that began by acknowledging the tragedy of Eli's death, while insisting that tragedy didn't justify abandoning principles designed to protect children from being judged by adult standards. She reminded the jury that Noah was 13 years old when these events occurred, an age when brains were scientifically proven to be under construction, when the capacity for impulse control and future-oriented thinking and moral reasoning was fundamentally limited compared to adults, when peer pressure and social humiliation carried neurological weight that adults who'd survived adolescence often forgot or minimized. Park described the week before Eli's death as a pressure cooker of teenage drama, rumors circulating, social media amplifying humiliation, Noah experiencing the kind of public embarrassment that for adolescents felt literally unbearable because they lacked the developmental capacity to understand that feelings change and wounds heal, and middle school hierarchies don't determine life outcomes. She wasn't justifying violence, she emphasized, but explaining the context in which a child's brain operating under extreme stress might make catastrophically bad decisions without the premeditation or cold calculation the prosecution would claim. Park's opening attacked the state's narrative of sophisticated planning by reframing the same facts through a developmental lens. Noah suggesting they meet at a familiar location wasn't tactical isolation, but a child choosing the place they'd hung out dozens of times before. Bringing a weapon wasn't premeditation, but impulsive grabbing something accessible when emotions overwhelmed judgment. Deleting messages afterward wasn't consciousness of guilt, but panicked response that teenagers engaged in constantly, because they lived in a digital world where everything felt temporary and erasable. She promised expert testimony would explain that adolescent brains processed consequences differently, that what looked like callousness might be emotional shutdown or dissociation, that smiles during serious conversations could reflect nervous system dysregulation rather than enjoyment, that the gap between understanding words like death and forever and actually comprehending their existential weight was enormous at 13. Park told the jury their job wasn't deciding whether Noah did something terrible. He had. And his family grieved for Eli alongside everyone else. But whether what he did reflected adult-level moral culpability or tragic developmental limitations that required accountability through rehabilitation rather than warehousing a child in adult prison for life. The prosecution's first witnesses established Eli's final hours through testimony that painted him as heartbreakingly normal, a boy whose ordinariness made his absence feel like a robbery of future potential rather than abstract loss. Teachers described Friday at school, noting Eli seemed distracted but not distressed, had turned in an English assignment on time, had eaten lunch with his usual friend group. A neighbor testified about seeing Eli Saturday afternoon shooting basketball hoops in his driveway, music playing from a phone propped on the garage step. Of the scene so typical that the neighbor had waved without really looking, had gone inside to start dinner, had learned hours later that the boy he'd seen alive and casual and bored on a weekend afternoon was gone in a way that didn't permit return. Marissa Harper took the stand to describe Eli's last morning at home, sleeping late, making himself cereal, asking if he could go to a friend's later. The kind of lazy Saturday negotiation that happened in households everywhere, conversations so mundane you didn't memorize them because you assumed infinite repetitions stretched ahead. Her voice stayed steady through most of her testimony, breaking only when the prosecutor asked her to confirm that Eli never came home for dinner, that the last time she saw her son alive was watching him walk down their driveway toward the Greenbelt entrance. A backpack slung over one shoulder, phone in hand, completely unprepared for what was about to happen because the person he was meeting was someone he loved. The crime scene witnesses provided factual foundation without unnecessary drama, establishing what was found and where and when, without dwelling on details that would traumatize, without informing. The jogger who discovered Eli's body described the moment of recognition. The transition from seeing something out of place to understanding it was someone, the immediate call to emergency services with the kind of shaking voice that audio recordings would later preserve as evidence of authentic shock. First responders documented the scene's condition, the preservation of evidence, the careful work of ensuring that horror didn't compromise investigation, but that emotional reaction didn't contaminate the physical record that would allow justice to proceed. The medical examiner testified with clinical precision about cause and manner of death, avoiding graphic descriptions while establishing facts the jury needed to understand. This was homicide. Death occurred during the time frame consistent with when Eli was known to be meeting Noah. Injuries indicated close-range violence rather than distance or accident. The testimony was deliberately dry, deliberately factual, deliberately boring in its technical language, because the prosecution understood that juries needed information, not spectacle, needed to understand what happened without being manipulated through gratuitous detail that served emotion rather than evidence. And then came the moment the courtroom had been anticipating. The prosecution introduced the doorbell camera footage, the digital witness that had captured what human witnesses couldn't provide. The technical foundation was established through Harold Chen's testimony about his security system, its continuous recording capability, the accuracy of its timestamps synchronized to network time servers, the chain of custody showing the USB drive had been properly preserved and the files hadn't been altered. Then the footage played on a large screen positioned so the jury could see clearly, and the courtroom went silent in the way that happens when everyone is watching the same image and understanding its significance simultaneously. Timestamp 4:12. P.M. Eli appeared walking with the loose-limbed gait of a kid who'd walked this route countless times. No hesitation, no fear, moving toward what he believed was conversation and reconciliation with someone who mattered to him. Timestamp 4:18. P.M. Noah entered the frame, hood up despite warm weather, hands in pockets creating bulk that suggested something carried, walking faster than Eli, closing the distance without calling out, and then both boys disappeared from view, heading toward the Greenbelt path. The timestamp clicked forward in silence, the empty sidewalk somehow ominous in its stillness. Then 5:02 p.m. Noah reappeared alone, walking significantly faster, glancing backward twice as though checking whether he was followed or observed. His right hand adjusting something at his waistband that created visible bulk under his jacket, his entire demeanor transformed from the casual approach of the earlier footage into something that read unmistakably as flight. The cross-examination of the footage focused on what it didn't show rather than what it did, Lena Park emphasizing that the camera captured public sidewalk activity but not the path itself, couldn't document what happened between the boys once they moved out of frame, couldn't prove who initiated violence, or what words were exchanged, or whether there were factors the jury needed to understand context. She asked Harold Chen whether other people used that entrance, whether the camera captured everyone who passed that afternoon, whether it was possible someone else had entered the Greenbelt through a different access point. Questions designed to inject uncertainty into the prosecution's timeline, to suggest alternative possibilities, even if those possibilities seemed statistically unlikely. But the footage's power wasn't primarily in what it proved legally. It established presence and timing, but not the act itself. Its power was emotional and cumulative, providing visual reference that made other evidence feel more concrete, showing the jury what Noah looked like before and after, letting them see with their own eyes the transformation from someone approaching a situation to someone fleeing it. Body language communicating guilt more effectively than any witness testimony could articulate. As the first day of trial concluded, Noah sat at the defense table with an expression that had cycled through boredom, attention, and something approaching fear as the evidence accumulated in ways his earlier smirking confidence hadn't anticipated. The jury watched him watch the footage of himself, and several later reported that his reaction, or lack thereof, had struck them as significant, that most people seeing video of themselves on the day they allegedly committed murder would show something, some emotion, some response, but Noah had remained oddly flat, occasionally glancing at the screen, then away, as though the person in the footage was someone else entirely. Dissociation or compartmentalization, or simply the practiced numbness of someone who had learned early that displaying authentic emotion provided leverage others could exploit. As the bailiff called for adjournment and the jury filed out and the courtroom slowly emptied, Marissa Harper remained sitting in the front row of the gallery, staring at the now blank screen where her son had appeared alive for the last documented time, moving with trust towards someone who'd already decided that friendship was less important than control, that Eli's life mattered less than Noah's wounded pride, that murder was an acceptable solution to the unbearable problem of adolescent humiliation. The screen went dark, but the image remained, burned into memory like trauma. The visual evidence that some betrayals were too complete to forgive and some losses too permanent to survive intact. The second day of trial began with the prosecution building what A.D.A. Soria called a digital archaeology of Noah Klein's final weeks, with Eli Harper, a systematic excavation of text messages, social media posts, and private communications that revealed the deterioration of their friendship in real time and established motive with the kind of clarity that rarely existed in criminal cases. The jury was introduced to the forensic analyst who'd extracted data from both boys' phones, a soft-spoken technician named Rebecca Park, who explained her methodology with the patience of someone accustomed to translating technical processes for lay audiences. How phones store data even after deletion. More how backups preserved messages users thought they'd erased. How metadata provided timestamps and location information that couldn't be faked without sophisticated knowledge most teenagers didn't possess. She walked the jury through the preservation process, the chain of custody, the verification techniques that ensured what they were about to see represented authentic communications rather than fabrications or alterations, establishing credibility before the content itself could be evaluated. Then the messages appeared on screen, projected large enough that everyone in the courtroom could read them simultaneously, Noah's voice preserved in the casual abbreviations and emoji-punctuated language of adolescent digital communication. The early messages showed friendship that looked normal from the outside, plans to play games online, complaints about teachers, jokes that required shared context to understand, the constant background hum of communication that characterized teenage relationships conducted primarily through screens rather than face-to-face interaction. But as the timeline progressed, the tone shifted in ways that prosecutors argued revealed Noah's increasing need for control and his reaction to perceived disloyalty. A message from 2 weeks before Eli's death showed Noah demanding to know why Eli had hung out with another friend without inviting him. Thought we were boys. Guess I was wrong. Eli's response was placating, apologetic. Wasn't planned. Ran into him at the store. You weren't answering. Noah's reply came 3 hours later, long enough to seem like strategic silence rather than simply being offline. People who matter answer. Remember that. The exchange looked like normal teenage drama until you understood it as part of a pattern. one of dozens of similar interactions where Noah positioned himself as the injured party, and Eli scrambled to repair offense he hadn't intentionally committed, each cycle training Eli to prioritize Noah's emotional state above his own comfort or autonomy. The week before the murder, the message history captured the social media incident that prosecutors argued became the catalyst for Noah's decision to eliminate Eli as a problem rather than continue managing him as a friend. Someone had posted a screenshot in a group chat that made Noah look foolish. The specific content was adolescent and would seem trivial to adults. Something about Noah bragging about an achievement that turned out to be exaggerated. The kind of small humiliation that happens constantly in teenage social ecosystems, but felt existentially devastating to the person experiencing it. The group chat erupted in laughing emojis and mocking comments, and although Eli hadn't posted the original screenshot, he'd been present in the chat and hadn't defended Noah, a sin of omission that Noah apparently interpreted as active betrayal. He sent Eli a private message Friday night, the night before the killing. "Saw you didn't say shit when they were clowning me? That's how it is?" Eli responded quickly, trying to de-escalate. "I didn't know what to say. It was awkward. People were just joking." Noah's response revealed the rigid thinking that characterized his worldview. Either you're with me or against me. There's no middle. Then after a pause, "We need to talk. Aren't for real this time." The Saturday coordination messages played out like stage directions for tragedy, Noah orchestrating the meeting with language that seemed reasonable on surface but revealed tactical thinking when examined closely. He suggested the Greenbelt path specifically, framing it as neutral territory but actually selecting isolation from potential witnesses or intervention. He emphasized, "Just us, no drama," language that sounded like a desire for privacy, but functioned as instruction for Eli to come alone, vulnerable, without the protection that other people's presence might have provided. He specified a time, 4:30 p.m., that aligned with when parents were typically occupied with dinner preparation when neighborhood foot traffic decreased. When daylight remained but wouldn't last long enough for extended search efforts if something went wrong. The defense would argue these were innocent details, that kids always specified times and places when making plans, that reading sinister intent into normal coordination was confirmation bias driven by knowing the outcome. But the prosecution countered that Noah's subsequent behavior, bringing a weapon, deleting evidence, lying about timeline, demonstrated these weren't innocent choices, but components of a plan whose purpose became clear only when all elements assembled together like a puzzle, revealing a picture nobody wanted to see. The message that devastated whatever remained of Noah's defense strategy came from the recovery of his communication with Tyler Rodriguez, the classmate who'd preserved what Noah thought he'd erased forever. Tyler took the stand looking younger than his 14 years, voice shaking slightly as he read aloud from printed exhibits that reproduced the messages prosecutors had entered into evidence. Saturday night, 11:16 p.m., Noah to Tyler. "He won't talk shit again." The courtroom absorbed those 5 words in silence, each person processing the implications simultaneously, the past tense that acknowledged something already completed, the finality of won't rather than shouldn't, or better not, the casual cruelty of reducing Eli's death to a problem successfully solved. Tyler's response, "WTF, are you talking about?" captured the disbelief anyone would feel receiving such a message. The cognitive dissonance of trying to reconcile friendly communication norms with what sounded like confession. Noah's follow-up message removed any ambiguity. "Don't tell, they can't prove it." That second message was arguably more damning than the first because it revealed consciousness of guilt, understanding that what he'd done required proof, awareness that detection was possible, but not certain if he managed information carefully and maintained silence from potential witnesses. Tyler testified about his emotional state reading those messages. how he'd initially tried to convince himself Noah was joking or quoting something or being deliberately provocative for attention. All the rationalization strategies people deploy when confronted with information their brains reject as impossible. He'd sent confused responses asking what Noah meant, receiving only a laughing emoji in reply, and then Tyler had done what most teenagers would do. He'd screenshot the conversation, not yet for evidentiary purposes, but because weird exchanges got saved and shared, because proving, "Can you believe what he said?" required documentation in digital culture. When Tyler learned Sunday that Eli was dead, that the friend Noah referred to in past tense was actually gone, the messages transformed from confusing to horrifying, from teenage posturing to potential evidence of murder. Tyler's father had found him staring at his phone Sunday evening, had asked what was wrong, and Tyler had made the hardest decision many teenagers face, betraying a peer's confidence because adult intervention was necessary, because some secrets were too dangerous to keep, because loyalty to the living sometimes required exposing the dead. The defense tried to impeach Tyler's credibility, suggesting he'd misinterpreted the messages or fabricated context to gain attention, but Tyler's obvious discomfort testifying against someone he'd considered a friend actually enhanced his credibility, made clear he wasn't enjoying the spotlight, but fulfilling a moral obligation despite social cost. The physical evidence phase of trial was less dramatic than digital revelations, but equally important for establishing that Noah's presence at the crime scene wasn't merely suspicious, but scientifically demonstrable. A forensic footwear analyst testified about the shoe impressions recovered near where Eli's body was found, explaining the methodology of comparing class characteristics, brand, model, size, with individual characteristics like wear patterns, damage, and unique features that narrowed possibilities from thousands of similar shoes to specific pairs worn by specific people. Photographs displayed side by side showed the crime scene impression and Noah's shoe sole, both featuring the distinctive missing tread segment on the right heel, a defect the analyst testified was unusual enough that finding it in both locations suggested either the same shoe or statistically improbable coincidence. The defense challenged the reliability of footwear comparison, noted that tread patterns degraded, and that visual matching wasn't as scientifically rigorous as DNA or fingerprints, objections that were technically valid but emotionally unpersuasive when jurors could see with their own eyes how closely the patterns aligned. Similarly, botanical evidence linking plant material from Noah's hoodie to species growing specifically in the Greenbelt area where Eli died wouldn't alone convict anyone, but added another thread to the web of proof that made coincidence explanations increasingly untenable. The ballistic evidence brought the trial's clinical proceedings closest to confronting the actual violence that had ended Eli's life, though testimony remained carefully constrained to avoid gratuitous detail while establishing necessary facts. The firearms examiner explained that projectile recovered during autopsy had been compared to test fires from the weapon seized from Noah's home, that microscopic markings called striations created by imperfections in the gun barrel acted like fingerprints, making each weapon's fired projectiles identifiable, that the comparison showed consistency sufficient to conclude the crime scene projectile had been fired from that specific weapon. The defense challenged whether Noah had access to the weapon, whether the biometric safe was truly accessible to a child, whether the gun could have been taken without Noah's knowledge by someone else with access to the household. But Noah's younger brother had already testified in a separate hearing that Noah had bragged about cracking the safe code, had shown him once how their father's finger movements could be observed and replicated, had demonstrated the kind of casual disregard for parental security measures that characterized adolescent rebellion in homes everywhere. The gun wasn't some illegal street weapon obtained through criminal networks. It was a household firearm stored inadequately, accessible to a child who understood enough about violence to know weapons provided power, but not enough about consequences to understand power's permanent cost. As the evidence phase concluded and the prosecution rested its case, Noah's demeanor at the defense table had visibly deteriorated from the smirking confidence of early proceedings to something that looked more like trapped awareness, the expression of someone watching their carefully constructed lies collapse under the weight of facts that didn't require belief or interpretation, that simply existed independent of his ability to charm or manipulate or perform. The jury had seen the doorbell footage showing he'd lied about when he left the Greenbelt. They'd seen the Wi-Fi logs proving he'd lied about his timeline. They'd seen his own words. He won't talk shit again. They can't prove it, demonstrating he'd lied about his knowledge and involvement. They'd seen physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene despite his claims of innocence. And perhaps most importantly, they'd seen his face in the courtroom, the inappropriate smiles and flat effect that made emotional connection difficult, that created psychological distance between his youth and their sympathy, that left them wondering not whether he'd done it, but what kind of 13-year-old was capable of such calculated cruelty toward someone who'd trusted him completely. The evidence montage had achieved its purpose, not creating doubt about guilt, but eliminating doubt about who Noah Klein was when the masks came off and the performance ended and the truth stood naked in fluorescent light, waiting to be acknowledged by 12 strangers whose job was witnessing horror without looking away. The defense's case began with Lena Park standing before the jury, carrying the impossible burden of arguing that everything they'd seen was both true and insufficient, that evidence proved action but not culpability of the type that justified treating a 13-year-old as irredeemable. She opened by acknowledging what couldn't be denied. Noah had been present when Eli died. Noah had made terrible choices. Noah's behavior afterward suggested panic and guilt, but she insisted the question before them wasn't whether something horrific had occurred, but whether a child's brain operating under developmental constraints could form the kind of intent the law required for murder convictions that carried life sentences. Park's strategy was risky because it required the jury to hold two contradictory ideas simultaneously: that Noah bore responsibility for his actions while also being fundamentally less responsible than an adult would be for identical actions. That age was both explanation and limitation. That sympathy for childhood and horror at specific deeds could coexist without one canceling the other. She was asking them to perform emotional and intellectual gymnastics that felt uncomfortable. That violated the instinct to make things simple by choosing either complete condemnation or complete absolution when the truth demanded something more nuanced and harder to sustain. The defense's expert witness, Dr. Marcus Brennan, was a developmental neuroscientist whose credentials filled 2 pages and whose testimony had been deemed admissible over prosecution objections, that it risked confusing the jury or invading their province to determine credibility. Dr. Brennan explained with chart-aided precision that adolescent brains remained under construction, that the prefrontal cortex responsible for executive function, impulse control, future planning, weighing consequences, moral reasoning, didn't fully mature until the mid-20s. That 13-year-olds were neurologically incapable of processing risk and reward with adult sophistication, regardless of how intelligent or articulate they appeared. He showed brain imaging studies demonstrating structural differences between adolescent and adult neural architecture, explaining that teenagers relied more heavily on the amygdala, the emotional reactive region, than the prefrontal cortex when making decisions under stress, meaning their choices were driven more by immediate emotional states than by rational assessment of long-term implications. Dr. Brennan testified that what looked like cold calculation to adult observers might actually reflect a child's inability to mentally simulate future emotional states, to understand that feelings change and wounds heal, to comprehend death's permanence as anything other than abstract concept lacking experiential weight. The cross-examination of Dr. Brennan was one of the trial's most compelling exchanges. A.D.A. Soria pushing back against generalizations about adolescent development by emphasizing that science described populations, not individuals, that neurology explained capacity but didn't determine choices, that plenty of 13-year-olds navigated social humiliation without resorting to murder, suggesting developmental limitations weren't destiny. Soria asked whether brain immaturity prevented teenagers from understanding basic moral rules. Dr. Brennan conceded it didn't. Whether adolescents understood death was permanent, Dr. Brennan acknowledged conceptual understanding existed even if emotional integration lagged. But whether planning behaviors could occur in youth despite impulse control deficits. Dr. Brennan admitted that sequential decision-making was possible, just more difficult to sustain. Soria then walked through Noah's specific actions, selecting an isolated location, bringing a weapon, deleting evidence, warning a friend not to tell, maintaining false timeline under questioning, asking after each whether developmental immaturity prevented that particular choice. Dr. Brennan's answers became increasingly qualified, acknowledging that none of those individual actions was beyond adolescent capability, that the question wasn't whether youth explained each decision, but whether the totality reflected adult-level moral culpability or tragic developmental limitations. A distinction that sounded clear in theory but dissolved into subjective judgment when applied to actual facts. The defense called several character witnesses, teachers and coaches who described Noah as a complicated kid with potential, someone who struggled with authority and peer relationships but showed moments of kindness and humor when stress levels decreased, someone whose behavior suggested underlying trauma or disorder rather than fixed evil. A middle school counselor testified about sessions with Noah where he discussed feeling misunderstood, struggling to maintain friendships, experiencing social anxiety that manifested as control-seeking rather than withdrawal. The testimony was designed to humanize Noah, to present him as someone suffering rather than someone inflicting suffering, to suggest that proper intervention earlier might have prevented tragedy, rather than being forced to respond to it after irreversible harm. But the prosecution's cross-examination highlighted that these same professionals had documented concerning patterns: Noah's refusal to take responsibility for conflicts, his tendency to blame others, his escalating attempts to control peers through manipulation and intimidation. Behaviors that caring adults had noticed but hadn't successfully addressed because Noah resisted authentic engagement, performed compliance in ways that satisfied immediate requirements while preserving the underlying patterns that eventually culminated in violence. The defense's most emotionally challenging task was addressing Noah's courtroom demeanor. The smiles and flat affect that had generated visceral negative reactions and threatened to override any sympathy his youth might otherwise generate. Park called Dr. Elena Vasquez, a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma responses, who testified that atypical emotional presentations weren't uncommon in adolescents facing overwhelming stress, that nervous laughter and inappropriate smiling were documented phenomena, that dissociation and emotional numbing could make youth appear callous when they were actually psychologically protecting themselves from realities too large to process. Dr. Vasquez explained that expecting defendants to perform grief or remorse in culturally prescribed ways risked punishing people for having nervous systems that responded differently to threat. That facial expressions were poor indicators of internal states, especially in individuals whose emotional development had been complicated by adverse experiences or neurological differences. The testimony provided a framework for understanding Noah's behavior that didn't require believing he was secretly devastated beneath the smiling exterior, just that his exterior presentation wasn't reliable evidence of moral character or future dangerousness. But the prosecution's cross-examination of Dr. Vasquez exposed the limits of explaining away what the jury had witnessed directly, because whatever theoretical validity existed for atypical trauma responses, Noah's specific patterns of smiling seemed to correlate with moments that maximized others' pain rather than reflecting random stress discharge. Soria presented a timeline. Noah smiled when Eli's mother entered the courtroom, when evidence of Eli's death was discussed, when witnesses described the family's grief, when his own behavior was characterized as callous. If these smiles were nervous system dysregulation, why did they cluster around moments where others were suffering rather than distributing randomly across proceedings? Dr. Vasquez acknowledged the pattern was concerning, but maintained that interpreting facial expressions as evidence of enjoyment rather than maladaptive coping was speculative. Soria's response was simple. He asked the jury to consider which interpretation aligned better with Noah's message to Tyler Rodriguez, sent hours after Eli died. Was, "He won't talk shit again," followed by a laughing emoji, evidence of someone traumatized by what happened, or someone satisfied by it. The question hung in the air unanswered because Dr. Vasquez's expertise was neurology and psychology, not mind reading, and ultimately the jury would have to decide what Noah's own words and expressions revealed about who he was beneath the competing expert narratives about who he might be. The defense introduced recorded phone calls from juvenile detention where Noah spoke with his mother, conversations prosecutors had successfully moved to exclude most of, but which the defense argued showed a vulnerable child struggling with confinement rather than a sociopath indifferent to consequences. In one call, Noah cried, actual tears, actual emotional breakdown, complaining that detention was scary, that other detainees threatened him, that he was isolated and frightened and wanted to come home. And the defense argued these moments revealed the real Noah, a child terrified by circumstances he couldn't control, emotionally overwhelmed in ways that suggested capacity for feeling even if he struggled to express it appropriately in formal settings. But the prosecution countered by highlighting what Noah didn't say in those calls. He never mentioned Eli's name, never expressed regret about what happened to his former best friend, never acknowledged the Harper family's loss or his role in creating it. His emotional distress was entirely self-focused, his fear, his discomfort, his desire for rescue, without apparent awareness that his suffering was consequence, while Eli's family's suffering was permanent loss, that his detention would eventually end while their grief wouldn't, and that the appropriate response to being detained for murder wasn't complaining about cafeteria food, but confronting what he'd done to necessitate confinement. The closing phase of the defense case required Lena Park to address the question that haunted the entire proceeding. If Noah wasn't a cold-hearted killer, if developmental immaturity explained his actions, if trauma and neurology conspired to produce tragic outcome without adult-level culpability, then what was he? Park's answer was carefully constructed. Noah was a child who'd made catastrophic choices his immature brain couldn't fully comprehend, who'd responded to perceived humiliation with violence because his developing neural architecture lacked the regulatory capacity to choose different responses. Who'd tried to cover his actions because panic and self-preservation were default settings in youth, lacking future-oriented thinking, who'd smiled inappropriately because his emotional expression was developmentally dysregulated, not because he enjoyed others' suffering. She insisted the jury could acknowledge Noah had killed Eli, while also acknowledging that 13-year-old killers weren't the same as adult killers, that the criminal justice system recognized this distinction through separate juvenile courts and different sentencing structures, that treating Noah as irredeemable at 13 meant giving up on the possibility that brains still under construction could be rebuilt differently through appropriate intervention. It was a humane argument, philosophically defensible, legally sound. It was also almost impossible to maintain emotionally when confronting actual evidence of actual choices that had ended actual life, when weighing abstract principles of childhood development against concrete images of Eli Harper smiling in school photos. against Marissa Harper's testimony about finding her son's empty bed, against the mathematical reality that Eli would never reach 14 while Noah was asking for the privilege of reaching adulthood, despite having stolen that privilege from someone who'd trusted him completely. The defense rested not with confidence, but with exhaustion, having made the best arguments available while knowing they were arguing against human nature's desire for simple categories, good or evil, child or monster, when the truth was probably both and neither, on something too complicated for courtrooms built on binary verdicts to adequately address. A D.A. Miguel Soria approached his closing argument the way an architect approaches a final blueprint review, walking the jury through the structure he'd built over weeks of testimony, pointing out how each piece of evidence supported and reinforced every other piece until the totality created something that couldn't be dismantled by attacking individual components. He began not with Noah but with Eli, projecting the school photo that had appeared throughout trial. A boy with an unself-conscious smile, hair that needed cutting, the face of someone who hadn't yet learned to pose for cameras because authenticity still felt safer than performance. Soria reminded the jury that Eli Harper was 13 years old, the same age as Noah. On experiencing the same developmental brain limitations the defense had spent days explaining, navigating the same treacherous social landscape of middle school hierarchies and digital drama and adolescent cruelty. The difference wasn't age or neurology or environmental stress. The difference was choice. Eli chose to be kind when others were cruel, chose loyalty even when friendship became complicated, chose to meet Noah that Saturday afternoon because repairing relationships mattered more than protecting pride. Noah chose isolation, chose to bring a weapon, chose violence, chose to walk away and delete evidence and lie and brag and smile at the family whose child he'd killed. Developmental immaturity might explain why those choices felt overwhelming in the moment, but it didn't explain why thousands of other 13-year-olds facing identical pressures chose differently every single day. Soria walked through the timeline with methodical precision, each element supported by evidence the jury had seen and could review during deliberations if memory needed reinforcement. Friday night, Noah sends Eli a message establishing the terms of their relationship in stark language. Either you're with me or against me. The kind of ultimatum that revealed someone who viewed friendship as loyalty oath rather than mutual affection. Saturday afternoon, Noah coordinates a meeting at the Greenbelt Path, specifying time and isolation, language that looked innocent only until you understood what happened next. 4:12 p.m. Doorbell camera captures Eli walking toward the meeting spot, relaxed and unhurried, on a boy with no reason to fear because the concept of danger from Noah didn't exist in his mental framework. 4:18 p.m. Noah follows, hooded and purposeful, carrying something that creates bulk under his clothing. 43 minutes pass. 43 minutes when two boys were alone in woods where no cameras reached. 43 minutes that ended with Eli dead and Noah walking away faster, glancing backward, adjusting something at his waist. 5:19 p.m. Noah's phone connects to home Wi-Fi, and within minutes he's deleting message threads, clearing history, erasing the digital trail that might connect him to what he'd just done. 11 to 16 p.m. Noah messages Tyler Rodriguez with words that would become the most damning evidence in the entire case. He won't talk shit again. But they can't prove it. The prosecution's closing emphasized that last message as the key to understanding everything that had come before it, because those words weren't sent in the heat of conflict or the confusion of immediate aftermath. They were sent 7 hours later after Noah had participated in community search efforts, after he'd hugged Eli's mother, after he'd performed grief and shock and concern for an audience he believed he could fool. He won't talk shit again was satisfaction, was problem solved, was the past tense of someone who'd achieved an objective and was reflecting on successful completion. they can't prove it, was consciousness of guilt, was understanding that what he'd done required evidence, was calculation about whether he'd covered his tracks sufficiently to avoid consequences. Together, those two sentences revealed more about Noah's mental state than any expert testimony about adolescent brain development could explain away, because they came directly from him in an unguarded moment when he thought he was safe to be honest. The defense wanted the jury to believe Noah was a confused child, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his developmental capacity to handle. Noah's own words revealed someone who understood exactly what he'd done and believed he was smart enough to get away with it, a miscalculation that existed not because his brain was immature, but because his assessment of the evidence's strength was wrong. Soria addressed the developmental neuroscience testimony directly, acknowledging it was scientifically valid while insisting it was legally irrelevant to the question before the jury. Yes, the 13-year-old brains were different from adult brains. The law recognized this through juvenile courts and different sentencing structures and constitutional protections against life without parole for youth. But those protections didn't mean 13-year-olds couldn't form intent, couldn't plan actions, couldn't understand that killing was wrong. If the defense's argument was correct, that developmental immaturity prevented Noah from comprehending his choices, then no teenager could ever be held accountable for anything, because they'd all have identical neurological limitations. The question wasn't whether Noah's brain was fully mature. It wasn't. The question was whether his actions demonstrated the kind of thinking, planning, and consciousness of wrongdoing that the law required for murder convictions. On the doorbell footage showing he'd lied about timeline demonstrated consciousness. The deleted messages demonstrated planning. The communication with Tyler demonstrated understanding that what he'd done was serious enough to require proof. And his behavior throughout proceedings, smiling at Eli's family, showing flat effect when discussing the victim, focusing entirely on his own inconveniences rather than the life he'd taken, demonstrated someone whose limitation wasn't developmental immaturity, but fundamental absence of the empathy that makes us human, regardless of age. The prosecution's conclusion was delivered with quiet intensity, Soria's voice dropping to force the jury to lean in and focus. The defense wants you to see Noah Klein as a child, and he is a child, but so was Eli Harper. Eli was a child when he walked to that greenbelt path trusting his best friend. He was a child when he sent his last text message asking where Noah was. He was a child when he died alone in the woods because someone he loved decided his life mattered less than a middle school grudge. If you want to show mercy to a child in this case, show mercy to the one who can't defend himself, who can't hire experts to explain his choices, who can't sit in a courtroom and smile at the jury hoping youth will substitute for accountability. Eli Harper deserves your mercy. He deserves a verdict that tells the truth about what happened to him. And the truth is simple. Noah Klein planned, executed, and concealed a murder. Then he bragged about it. The evidence proves it. Your job is to acknowledge it. Soria returned to his seat without theatrical flourish, trusting that the weight of evidence spoke louder than performative emotion, that the jury understood their role wasn't choosing who to feel sorry for, but determining what the facts proved beyond reasonable doubt. Lena Park's closing argument began by acknowledging the emotional weight of the case, the horror every parent in the jury box must feel imagining their own child in Eli's position, the instinctive desire to hold someone accountable in ways that matched the magnitude of loss. She understood that desire, shared it even, but reminded the jury that justice required more than satisfying emotional needs, required adherence to principles that protected all of us from being judged in our worst moments without consideration of context and capacity. Park asked them to remember that Noah was 13 years old, a fact the prosecution had tried to minimize by emphasizing sophistication in planning. But age wasn't just a number. It was a neurological reality documented by decades of research showing adolescent brains processed information differently, responded to stress differently. assessed consequences differently than adults. The prosecution wanted them to believe Noah's actions revealed adult-level calculation, but what they actually revealed was a child's attempt to solve an emotional problem he lacked the developmental capacity to solve appropriately, whose immature brain under stress defaulted to fight-or-flight responses without the regulatory override that comes with neurological maturity. Park reminded the jury that finding Noah guilty of first-degree murder meant accepting he'd formed intent to kill, had planned it in advance. "I had executed that plan with deliberation and premeditation, the highest level of culpability the law recognized, the standard typically reserved for adults who'd fully developed the cognitive machinery necessary for that kind of sophisticated moral reasoning." But the evidence showed something different. Two boys with a week of escalating tension, social media drama that felt existentially important in the moment but would seem trivial in hindsight. A meeting arranged in language that could be reconciliation or confrontation depending on interpretation, 43 minutes in the woods where something went terribly wrong, and then panicked aftermath where a frightened child tried desperately to make the situation disappear because he couldn't process its permanence. And the message to Tyler Rodriguez that prosecutors called consciousness of guilt could equally be a child's bravado, trying to sound tough and in control when actually terrified, the kind of posturing teenagers engaged in constantly because admitting fear felt like social death. The deletion of evidence that prosecutors called sophisticated planning could equally be a child's magical thinking, the belief that erasing digital traces could erase reality. The same reasoning that made kids think closing their eyes made them invisible. The defense closing acknowledged Noah's courtroom demeanor had been problematic, that his smiling and flat effect had made emotional connection difficult. But Park reminded the jury they were deciding guilt based on evidence, not likability, facts, not facial expressions. If they convicted because Noah didn't perform remorse in ways they found satisfying, they'd be punishing him for having trauma responses or neurological differences that affected emotional presentation. They'd be requiring defendants to be actors skilled enough to display culturally prescribed grief on demand, or face enhanced penalties for authenticity that didn't match expectations. The law said guilt must be proven beyond reasonable doubt based on what happened, not on how the defendant reacted to proceedings afterward. And when they examined what actually happened, stripped of emotional overlay and expert interpretation and competing narratives, what they saw was tragic evidence of developmental limitations intersecting with adverse circumstances and inadequate adult intervention. A perfect storm that produced horrific outcome without necessarily proving the kind of cold, premeditated murder the prosecution alleged. Park concluded by reminding the jury that verdicts in cases involving juveniles carried extra weight because they weren't just determining guilt, but effectively determining whether a child's entire future would be foreclosed based on actions taken when their brain was literally under construction. If they convicted Noah of first-degree murder, as charged, they'd be saying a 13-year-old was irredeemable, that no amount of growth or development or intervention over the coming decades could ever transform him into someone who deserved freedom, that the person he was at 13 was the person he'd always be, despite everything science knew about neuroplasticity and development and the human capacity for change. She asked them to consider lesser charges that acknowledged Noah's responsibility while preserving some possibility for rehabilitation. Verdicts that said what happened was terrible, but the boy who did it might someday become a man who understood and regretted and transformed himself into someone different. "Don't give up on childhood," she said in conclusion. "Don't decide at 13 that a human being's story is finished. That's not justice. That's despair. And our system is supposed to be built on hope." The jury received their instructions from Judge Rourke with the gravity appropriate to a decision that would alter multiple lives permanently. Legal standards explained in language that sounded clear until you tried to apply them to messy reality. They were told to consider evidence only, to separate sympathy from analysis, to evaluate witness credibility, to distinguish between what was proven and what was merely suggested. They were instructed on the elements of first-degree murder, the definitions of premeditation and deliberation, the standards for lesser-included offenses. They were reminded that Noah's age was a factor to consider, but not a trump card that automatically precluded conviction, that developmental immaturity was relevant context, but not a defense that erased accountability. And then they disappeared behind a heavy door into a deliberation room where 12 strangers would attempt to achieve unanimous agreement about questions that philosophers and neuroscientists and legal scholars debated without consensus. In the courthouse hallways, Eli's family waited with the kind of exhausted patience that comes from understanding time moves differently when you're suspended between past trauma and future verdict. Noah sat with his attorney in a small conference room, picking at his cuticles until they bled, his earlier swagger completely evaporated, replaced by the expression of someone who'd finally understood the game was real and losing meant permanent consequences. The jury deliberated for 7 hours across 2 days, and sending notes to the judge that revealed the complexity of their task, requests to review the doorbell footage again, to reread Noah's messages to Tyler, to clarify instructions about lesser charges. Each note generated speculation from observers trying to decode meaning from sparse communication, prosecution, interpreting requests as good signs, and defense interpreting the same requests as favorable indicators, everyone projecting their desires onto ambiguous tea leaves. When the buzzer finally sounded indicating a verdict had been reached, the courthouse transformed from suspended animation to urgent mobilization. Participants summoned, gallery filled, cameras positioned outside for the announcement that would follow. Noah entered the courtroom looking smaller than he had throughout trial. It as though the waiting had physically diminished him, and for the first time his expression showed something that looked like authentic fear rather than performed emotion or defensive numbness. Judge Rourke asked if the jury had reached a verdict. The foreperson stood, holding a paper that seemed to weigh more than its physical mass suggested, and confirmed they had. The courtroom held its collective breath in the moment before truth became official, before 12 strangers' assessment of evidence transformed from deliberation into declaration, before Noah Klein learned whether his future would be measured in years or decades, and before Eli Harper's family learned whether the system designed to deliver justice would acknowledge the magnitude of what had been taken from them when their child went to meet his best friend and never came home. The foreperson was a middle-aged man named Robert Chen, a high school math teacher whose face throughout the trial had remained studiedly neutral, revealing nothing of the internal calculations he was performing as evidence accumulated and arguments competed for primacy in a mind trained to value logic over emotion. He unfolded the verdict form with hands that trembled slightly, not from uncertainty about the decision, but from understanding the weight of speaking words that would permanently alter the trajectory of lives, that would transform legal abstractions about guilt and innocence into concrete consequences measured in years and loss and irreversible judgment. Judge Rourke asked him to read the verdict aloud, and in the moment before he spoke, the courtroom achieved a quality of silence so complete that the building's ventilation system became audible, a mechanical breath underlying human suspense. In the matter of the state versus Noah Klein, on the charge of murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. The word guilty landed with physical force, despite being delivered in a voice that barely rose above conversational volume, the syllables cutting through the silence like a blade through fabric, clean and irreversible and final. Marissa Harper's response was visceral and immediate. A sound emerged from her throat that wasn't quite a sob or a gasp, but something more primitive, the noise a body makes when tension held for months finally releases, and the muscles and lungs and vocal cords all express relief simultaneously without conscious direction. She doubled forward in her seat, face pressing into her hands, shoulders shaking with the force of tears that were grief and gratitude mixed together in proportions impossible to separate, mourning her son while experiencing a grim satisfaction that the system had acknowledged his murder as murder rather than minimizing it through legal technicalities or misplaced sympathy for the killer's youth. Eli's father remained upright but rigid, as though moving would shatter the fragile composure holding him together, and tears tracked down his face in steady lines that he made no effort to wipe away. Emma, Eli's little sister, didn't fully understand the legal terminology, but she understood the emotions saturating the room, understood that something important had happened that the adults around her had been waiting for, and she gripped her mother's hand with the fierce intensity of a child trying to provide comfort she was too young to fully conceptualize. Noah's reaction unfolded in stages, his face cycling through expressions faster than conscious control could regulate. First incomprehension, as though the words hadn't properly registered, then a flash of anger that tightened his jaw and narrowed his eyes. Then something that looked like genuine fear, as the reality of guilty connected to memories of testimony about sentencing ranges and life imprisonment and futures that would never include freedom or normalcy or the second chances he'd apparently believed his youth would guarantee. His mouth opened slightly as if to speak, to object, to deploy the charm and manipulation that had worked on adults throughout his childhood when consequences threatened. But no sound emerged because courtrooms operated under rules that didn't care about his preference for how reality should work. He turned to look at his attorney, Lena Park, with an expression that contained accusation, as though she had failed him by not successfully selling the jury on narratives about developmental immaturity, as though her failure to achieve acquittal was betrayal equivalent to the friendship betrayal he'd punished Eli for committing. Park's face showed exhaustion and something that might have been relief that her ethical obligation to provide zealous defense had concluded that she could stop arguing for mercy towards someone whose behavior throughout proceedings had made mercy feel like a philosophical exercise rather than an emotional imperative. Judge Rourke maintained procedural calm while the courtroom processed the verdict's emotional weight, allowing a moment for grief and relief to express themselves before reimposing the formal structure that separated legal proceedings from raw human reaction. She thanked the jury for their service, acknowledging the difficulty of the task they'd undertaken and the conscientiousness they'd demonstrated through their questions and deliberation timeline. She set a sentencing date 6 weeks out, explaining that the pre-sentence investigation would include psychological evaluations, victim impact statements, assessment of Noah's institutional behavior during detention, and compilation of information relevant to determining an appropriate sentence within the statutory range for juvenile offenders convicted of first-degree murder. She reminded everyone that while guilt had been determined, the sentencing phase would provide opportunity for both sides to present additional context about punishment's appropriate severity and structure, whether some possibility of eventual parole should be preserved, or whether life without parole was legally and morally justified, given Noah's age at the time of the offense. The judge ordered Noah remanded to custody pending sentencing, and the bailiffs approached with handcuffs that clicked onto his wrists, with sounds that had appeared throughout the trial, but carried different meaning now. No longer temporary restraint during proceedings, but the beginning of permanent custody that would extend across years and decades, depending on the sentence yet to be imposed. Noah stood when directed, moving with mechanical compliance that suggested his body was following instructions, while his mind remained several steps behind, still processing the gap between what he'd expected would happen and what actually had happened. As the bailiffs guided him toward the door that led to holding cells and transport vehicles and the institutional architecture of incarceration, Noah looked back at the courtroom once, not toward his mother who was crying with her face buried in her hands, not toward his father who sat with the posture of someone who'd been struck and hadn't yet fallen, but toward Eli's family with an expression that observers would later debate, some seeing fear and others seeing resentment, some detecting the first signs of genuine remorse, and others seeing only self-pity that he'd been caught and convicted, despite believing his youth would function as armor against accountability. The courtroom slowly emptied as participants processed the verdict in their own ways. Prosecutors shaking hands with restrained satisfaction because celebrating a child's murder conviction felt inappropriate even when you believed it was the correct outcome. Defense team gathering materials with the exhausted movements of people who'd fought hard and lost and would need time to recover before considering appellate strategies. Eli's extended family surrounded Marissa and her husband and daughter, creating a protective circle of people who'd been witnesses to their grief and would now be witnesses to whatever came next. The sentencing and the victim impact statements and the lifelong process of learning to exist around a hole that would never be filled. Because murdered children don't get replaced, they just leave permanent absences that families navigate around like furniture you can't move. Journalists rushed to file stories, translating legal terminology and courtroom drama into headlines and leads and social media posts that would reach audiences far beyond Briar Glen, feeding the public appetite for stories about youth and violence and justice's attempts to respond to horrors that challenged comfortable assumptions about childhood innocence and developmental capacity. In the victim advocate's office down the hall from the courtroom, Marissa Harper sat with her family and tried to articulate what the verdict meant, what it changed, and what it couldn't change, and the words came haltingly because grief and relief were poor dance partners, constantly stepping on each other and creating emotional dissonance that rational explanation couldn't resolve. She said the verdict meant Eli mattered. It meant what happened to him was treated seriously by a system that could have minimized it through legal technicalities or excessive sympathy for Noah's youth. Meant that 12 strangers had looked at the evidence and agreed that her son had been murdered rather than accepting defense narratives that reframed premeditated killing as tragic developmental misfire. But the verdict didn't bring Eli back, didn't fill his empty bedroom or replace his voice, or restore all the futures he'd never experienced, graduations and first jobs and relationships and children of his own that existed now only as ghost possibilities, alternate timelines where he survived past 13 and got to discover who he'd become. The verdict was justice, and justice mattered. But it wasn't healing, and it wasn't closure, and it wasn't even really satisfaction. It was just acknowledgement, the system saying, we see what was done, and we name it correctly, and we impose consequences. And sometimes, when you'd lost everything that mattered, acknowledgement was the best you could hope for, the only thing that separated meaningless death from death that at least received proper witness. As afternoon faded toward evening and the courthouse quieted, and the participants dispersed to process the verdict in private spaces away from cameras and crowds, Noah Klein sat in a juvenile detention cell measuring roughly 8 by 10 feet, staring at walls that would be his primary visual landscape for longer than he'd currently been alive, and the reality of guilty settling into his consciousness with the gradual weight of water soaking into fabric. The smile that had characterized his courtroom demeanor was nowhere to be found, replaced by an expression that was harder to read, possibly fear, possibly anger, possibly the first stirrings of comprehension that his actions had produced consequences. His developmental neuroscience couldn't explain away that charm and manipulation and performed emotions had limits, that the world had rules that applied even to people who believed themselves exceptional or misunderstood or entitled to immunity based on youth. Whether that expression would evolve into genuine remorse over the coming weeks and months and years, whether Noah would eventually become someone capable of understanding what he'd taken from Eli and the Harper family, whether the brain plasticity and developmental capacity that experts testified about would manifest as growth toward empathy or simply more sophisticated versions of the same manipulative patterns, those questions remained unanswered, suspended in the space between verdict and sentencing, between present reality and unknowable future. The jury had spoken. The verdict was rendered. And the machinery of justice moved forward toward its next phase, where numbers would be attached to guilt, and a judge would attempt the impossible task of quantifying how many years in prison equaled adequate response to the murder of a child by another child. A calculation that had no right answer because some equations were designed to produce only tragic solutions regardless of how carefully you arrange the variables. The 6 weeks between verdict and sentencing transformed the case from legal proceeding to cultural referendum, generating op-eds and think pieces and social media debates about juvenile justice, brain development, and the impossible question of how society should respond when children commit adult crimes. Briar Glen residents found themselves quoted in national publications, their town becoming shorthand for suburban safety's illusion, their grief and confusion packaged into narratives about everything from gun storage to social media toxicity to the failure of mental health systems. But for the Harper family, those 6 weeks weren't about theory or policy. They were about preparing to stand in front of the person who'd killed their son and find language adequate to describe a loss that exceeded vocabulary's capacity, to speak grief aloud in a courtroom that would measure their pain and weigh it against legal standards and constitutional protections and sentencing guidelines that tried to impose rational structure on emotional devastation. Marissa Harper wrote and rewrote her victim impact statement dozens of times, each draft attempting to capture something essential about Eli that the trial had reduced to exhibits and testimony. Each version struggling to balance rage and dignity, to honor her son without performing grief for an audience, to speak truth without losing herself in the process. The sentencing hearing convened on a gray November morning, the kind of day where low clouds pressed against the earth and light seemed rationed, the weather matching the mood of proceedings that everyone understood would be emotionally brutal regardless of the outcome. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, spectators standing along the back wall because every seat had been claimed, the public gallery containing a mix of victim supporters, curious observers, and a handful of Noah's extended family members whose presence required courage given the community's collective judgment that supporting him meant betraying Eli. Judge Rourke entered with the bearing of someone carrying weight that couldn't be delegated or deferred, someone who'd spent the intervening weeks reviewing pre-sentence reports and psychological evaluations and legal precedents, preparing to make a decision that would satisfy no one completely because the situation demanded outcomes that reality couldn't provide. Both accountability for the child who'd killed and acknowledgement of his youth, both punishment severe enough to match the crime's gravity, and hope that humans could change given time and intervention. The judge's face revealed nothing of her internal deliberations, maintaining the judicial neutrality that separated law from emotion even as she prepared to deliver a sentence that would be intensely emotional for everyone it affected. The victim impact statements began with Eli's maternal grandmother, she a woman in her 70s whose voice shook but never broke as she described what Noah had stolen, not just from Eli, but from everyone who'd loved him. Grandchildren she'd never meet, conversations that would never happen, the particular joy of watching someone you loved grow into themselves over decades rather than being frozen at 13 forever. She spoke about holidays that felt hollow now, about how she couldn't watch children playing without calculating what age Eli would be, about how grief wasn't a process that moved forward, but a permanent companion that changed shape but never departed. Her statement was brief, maybe 3 minutes, but it established the emotional foundation for what followed. Loss measured not just in a single death but in cascading futures erased, in family structures permanently altered, and in the slow accumulation of missed moments that would stretch across lifetimes. When she returned to her seat, she looked at Noah directly, not with hatred, but with something more devastating, a kind of tired confusion that asked without words how someone could do this and why her grandson had been the one chosen to absorb another child's rage. Eli's father approached the podium with a single page of handwritten notes that he'd composed in fragments over weeks, writing sentences between work meetings and during sleepless nights when memories of his son overwhelmed his capacity for normal function. His statement focused on specific details, tiny moments that hadn't made it into trial testimony because they weren't legally relevant, but were personally essential. The way Eli had learned to ride a bike by refusing training wheels and falling 100 times until he figured out balance. The way he'd insisted on doing his little sister's hair for school picture day because he'd watched YouTube tutorials and wanted to help. The way he'd asked questions about his father's job with genuine interest rather than polite performance. These details were offered not as evidence, but as memorial, an insistence that Eli had been a complete person with preferences and quirks and a developing personality that deserved to be remembered beyond the fact of his murder. Eli's father spoke about learning that his son was dead, and about the specific quality of silence that follows words like, "We found him," and "he didn't survive," about how his brain had kept offering bargains and alternatives and impossible scenarios where maybe the police were wrong or this was a terrible mistake, anything to avoid accepting the permanent finality of death. When he looked at Noah, his expression contained no anger, just exhausted bewilderment, the face of someone who'd spent months trying to understand and had concluded that understanding wasn't possible, that some actions existed outside the realm where empathy could reach. Then Marissa Harper stood, carrying pages that represented dozens of drafts and hundreds of hours spent trying to translate grief into language that could function in a legal setting without betraying the rawness of what she actually felt. She began by thanking the jury and the judge and the prosecution team, rituals of courtesy that provided structure before she had to speak the harder truths. Then she turned to face Noah directly, and the courtroom went absolutely silent in recognition that something significant was about to happen. She said she used to think of him as a second son, that he'd been in her home so often she'd bought extra groceries to account for his appetite, that she'd driven him to school events and listened to him talk about his problems and tried to be the kind of adult he could trust when his own parents felt too close to adolescent drama. She said she'd loved him not because she had to, but because he'd been important to Eli, and people you loved made you care about the people they loved. Expanding your circle through association until you carried affection for people you might never have noticed otherwise. She said that love made what happened feel less like random violence and more like intimate betrayal, because Noah had used access she'd granted him, trust she'd extended, to hurt the person she'd loved most in the world. Marissa's statement shifted from past relationship to present absence, describing what life looked like now in the Harper household. Eli's bedroom that she couldn't bring herself to change, his clothes still in the closet, emitting smells that were fading despite her irrational preservation attempts, his homework still on the desk awaiting completion that would never come. She described the phantom routines, how she still set the table for 4 people before remembering they were 3. How she still listened for his key in the door around the time school ended before the knowledge reasserted itself that school had ended permanently for him 6 months ago. She spoke about Emma, Eli's sister, who'd stopped sleeping through the night because nightmares about losing people she loved had colonized her unconscious mind, who'd stopped talking about her brother because the adult's grief felt too large to burden with a child's memories, who was learning at 10 years old that the world was less safe than anyone had promised, and that people you loved could vanish without warning. These details accumulated into a portrait of loss that extended far beyond a single death, rippling outward through family systems and community relationships and the collective sense of safety that Briar Glen had taken for granted before learning that danger lived inside their boundaries rather than being something that happened elsewhere to other people. The statement's conclusion contained the line that would be quoted in every news article about the sentencing, the sentence that captured what 6 months of grief and rage and confusion had distilled into essential truth. Marissa looked directly at Noah and said, "You walked into that green belt with my son, and you walked out alone. You had 43 minutes to change your mind, to stop, to remember that the person you were hurting had been your best friend, had trusted you, He had come there because he believed friendship mattered more than whatever disagreement you were having. But you didn't stop. You killed him, and then you tried to erase what you'd done, and then you smiled at me in a courtroom while I buried my child. I used to think you were another son. Now when I think of you, I don't see a child. I see the person who made sure my actual child would never grow up, would never become whoever he was supposed to be. And I hope you remember his name every single day for the rest of your life. Not Noah Klein's victim, not the boy from the Greenbelt. Eli Harper. Say his name. Remember what you took. Her voice finally broke on the last sentence, tears coming not from weakness, but from the impossibility of containing that much emotion within the formal constraints of courtroom proceedings. And when she returned to her seat, the silence felt sacred, the kind of quiet that follows testimony so true that response would be violation. Emma Harper was the final family member to speak, accompanied by the victim advocate, because at 10 years old, she needed support to navigate the intimidating formality of the courtroom and the complexity of addressing someone who'd hurt her family in ways she was still learning to understand. Her statement was the shortest, maybe 90 seconds, but in some ways the most devastating because it lacked the sophisticated emotional processing of adult grief, offering instead the raw simplicity of a child trying to articulate loss without adequate vocabulary. She said she missed her brother, that he used to help her with math homework and let her watch him play video games, and taught her how to ride his skateboard even though their mom said it was too dangerous. She said she didn't understand why Noah had hurt Eli when they were supposed to be best friends, because in her understanding of the world, best friends were the people who kept you safe, not the people you needed safety from. She said she was scared now in ways she hadn't been before, worried that other people she loved might disappear, that her parents might not come home one day, that the world was full of hidden dangers disguised as familiar faces. When she finished, she looked at Noah with an expression of pure confusion, on the face of a child whose worldview had been shattered and who was searching for explanation that might restore some sense of order or logic or fairness to a universe that had revealed itself as fundamentally unsafe. Noah looked back at her briefly, then away, unable or unwilling to maintain eye contact with the little sister of the boy he'd killed. And in that moment of averted gaze, the courtroom saw perhaps the clearest evidence of his limitation. Not developmental immaturity or neurological deficits, but the simple human failure to face what he'd done and who it had hurt. The defense's mitigation presentation began with Lena Park introducing the final round of expert testimony, psychologists and social workers who'd evaluated Noah during the pre-sentence investigation period, professionals who'd attempted to construct a narrative that acknowledged his guilt while preserving some framework for understanding him as a salvageable human being whose 13-year-old self didn't have to define his entire existence. Dr. Patricia Vance, a forensic psychologist who'd conducted extensive interviews with Noah, testified that he demonstrated capacity for emotional growth, even if current presentations suggested limited empathy, that structured therapeutic interventions combined with developmental maturation over decades could potentially produce someone capable of insight and remorse that weren't accessible to him now. She emphasized research showing that adolescent personality traits were fluid rather than fixed. I did that the neural plasticity that made teenagers vulnerable to poor decisions also made them uniquely responsive to intervention. That writing off a 13-year-old as permanently damaged ignored everything neuroscience understood about human development's trajectory. Her testimony was careful to avoid claiming Noah had already transformed or shown authentic remorse. She acknowledged his institutional behavior remained problematic, that he continued struggling with accountability and tended to frame himself as victim of circumstances rather than architect of tragedy. But she insisted that current limitations didn't predict permanent incapacity, that decades of growth remained possible even if not guaranteed. The defense presented letters from Noah's teachers and former coaches, People who'd known him before the murder and could testify to moments when he'd demonstrated kindness or humor or potential that suggested something redeemable existed beneath the behaviors that had dominated trial coverage. A middle school art teacher described a project where Noah had spent weeks creating a detailed drawing as a gift for his younger brother's birthday, work that required patience and consideration for another person's preferences. Evidence that he was capable of thinking beyond immediate self-interest when stress levels permitted. A youth soccer coach mentioned times when Noah had encouraged struggling teammates, offered assistance without being asked, demonstrated the kind of automatic generosity that suggested his capacity for empathy wasn't entirely absent, even if it was inconsistently accessible. These testimonials felt painfully inadequate against the weight of murder and the victim impact statements that had preceded them, like bringing flowers to a battlefield and hoping beauty might counterbalance devastation. But they served a legal and philosophical purpose. Establishing that the person who'd killed Eli wasn't a cartoon villain, but a complicated human whose worst actions didn't necessarily represent his full capacity. That judging him solely on his absolute worst day meant ignoring data points that complicated the narrative of irredeemable monster. Jennifer Klein took the stand on her son's behalf, a decision that required courage given the community's judgment and the knowledge that her testimony might be received with hostility rather than sympathy. She spoke about Noah's childhood, early developmental concerns that had been addressed through occupational therapy and counseling, struggles with emotional regulation, and peer relationships that had seemed manageable when he was younger, but had escalated in ways she hadn't recognized as dangerous until catastrophe forced retrospective clarity. She described seeking help, pediatrician consultations, therapy appointments that Noah had resisted or performed through without authentic engagement, conversations with school counselors that had generated behavioral plans but not fundamental change. She acknowledged failures in supervision, the gun safe that hadn't been secured adequately, the assumptions about Noah's maturity and judgment that had proven tragically wrong. Her testimony wasn't presented as excuse, but as context. An attempt to show that Noah existed within systems of family and community and institutional response that had all failed in various ways. That individual culpability didn't erase the collective failures that had permitted tragedy to occur. When prosecutors cross-examined her about specific warning signs she'd minimized or ignored, she didn't deflect. She admitted she'd rationalized behaviors that frightened her because acknowledging their significance would have required interventions she didn't know how to access or implement. That parenting a difficult child involved constant calculations about what was normal adolescent rebellion versus what required professional intervention. That she'd chosen wrong and would live with that knowledge for the rest of her life. Then came the moment the courtroom had been anticipating with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Noah's opportunity to address the court, to speak on his own behalf before the judge imposed a sentence that would determine whether he spent decades in prison or his entire life there. He stood at the defense table, dressed in clothes his mother had brought that were supposed to make him look young and vulnerable, but instead hung on his frame like costume, emphasizing the performance rather than the person. He'd been coached extensively by Lena Park about what to say and how to say it, about the importance of expressing remorse and taking responsibility and demonstrating understanding of the harm he'd caused, about avoiding the defensive posturing and self-focus that had characterized his earlier statements. He began by saying he was sorry, so words that sounded rehearsed in the way that truth often does when it's been practiced repeatedly. And he said he thought about Eli every day, about what he'd taken from him and from his family. But within sentences, his allocution began sliding toward the patterns that had characterized all his previous communications. He talked about how hard detention was, how isolated he felt, how people had turned against him without hearing his side, how the media coverage had made him look worse than he was. He mentioned Eli's name but quickly pivoted back to his own suffering, his own fear about sentencing, his own desire for a chance to prove he could change if given the opportunity. The disconnect between Noah's words and his underlying message was stark enough that even observers sympathetic to juvenile rehabilitation found themselves uncomfortable, watching someone claim remorse while demonstrating through emphasis and focus that he remained primarily concerned with his own experience rather than the victim's permanent absence. When he said he wished he could undo what happened, it sounded less like grief about Eli's death and more like regret about being caught, about facing consequences, about the disruption to his own life trajectory. When he looked toward the Harper family, his expression seemed to be searching for signs of forgiveness or softening rather than offering authentic apology that expected nothing in return. The look of someone still trying to manipulate outcomes through performance rather than accepting that some actions severed relationships permanently and irreparably. As he concluded his statement and sat down, he looked almost relieved, as though he'd completed an unpleasant assignment and could now return to the role of passive recipient of others' decisions rather than active participant in moral reckoning. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that might have been reassurance or might have been restraint, keeping him anchored as the final arguments proceeded toward the judgment that would define the rest of his life. D.A. Miguel Soria's sentencing argument was brief because the facts spoke with sufficient clarity that elaboration risked undermining through excess what simplicity communicated effectively. And he reminded the judge that the law required consideration of Noah's youth, but didn't mandate that youth override all other factors, that the court's obligation was balancing developmental capacity against community safety and the severity of premeditated murder. He emphasized that rehabilitation's possibility didn't eliminate the need for consequences proportional to harm, that hoping Noah might change over decades didn't erase the fact that Eli Harper would never have decades. That mercy toward the defendant couldn't require forgetting the victim. Soria noted that Noah had shown no genuine remorse throughout proceedings, that his allocution moments earlier had focused primarily on himself, that his institutional behavior suggested he remained primarily concerned with his own comfort rather than grappling with moral weight of his actions. And he asked the judge to impose a sentence that reflected the seriousness of what Noah had done: first-degree murder of a trusted friend through planning and premeditation, while acknowledging that juvenile sentencing law prohibited automatic life without parole, requiring instead a sentence that preserved at least theoretical possibility of eventual release if Noah demonstrated decades of authentic transformation. Judge Rourke took a 10-minute recess before delivering her sentencing decision, time she spent alone in chambers reviewing notes and precedents and the pre-sentence investigation report, preparing to speak words that would carry permanent consequences for everyone they touched. When she returned to the bench, her expression was composed, but her voice carried weight that made clear she understood the magnitude of what she was about to impose. She began by addressing the philosophical complexity of sentencing a child to adult punishment, acknowledging the valid concerns raised by the defense about developmental immaturity and capacity for change, noting that the law required her to treat youth as a significant mitigating factor. She said she'd reviewed extensive research about adolescent brain development, had considered expert testimony about Noah's specific psychological profile, had examined his institutional behavior and statements for evidence of growth or insight. And then her tone shifted, became harder, as she transitioned from acknowledging mitigation to explaining why it was insufficient to override other factors that sentencing required her to weigh. The judge said she'd watched Noah throughout the proceedings, had observed his reactions to testimony and evidence and victim impact statements, had noted his expressions and body language and the disconnect between what he said and how he behaved. She referenced the smiling, not as evidence of guilt, the jury had already determined guilt, but as evidence of character relevant to assessing future dangerousness and capacity for rehabilitation. She said she'd seen defendants express remorse in many ways over her decades on the bench, had learned to distinguish between authentic accountability and performed contrition designed to manipulate outcomes. And she said that nothing in Noah's presentation suggested he understood at a meaningful level what he'd taken from Eli Harper, from the Harper family, from the community that had trusted its children to each other's care. She noted his allocution that morning, how quickly it had devolved from apology into self-focus, how his primary concern remained his own suffering rather than the permanent loss he'd inflicted. She said that youth explained developmental limitations but didn't excuse refusal to engage with those limitations. Honestly, that 13 was young, but not so young that concepts like death and permanence and other people's full humanity were incomprehensible. Judge Rourke announced the sentence with the careful precision of someone who'd weighed every word: life imprisonment with possibility of parole after 40 years. A sentence structured to satisfy constitutional requirements that juvenile offenders receive meaningful opportunity for release, while also reflecting the severity of premeditated murder and the concerning absence of remorse or insight. She explained that 40 years represented a sentence long enough that Noah would be in his 50s before parole consideration, that he would spend longer in prison than he'd currently been alive, that the majority of his existence would be defined by incarceration structure and limitations. But she also explained that the sentence preserved theoretical possibility of freedom if, and she emphasized the conditional nature, if Noah used those decades to develop genuine empathy, authentic remorse, and demonstrated transformation significant enough to satisfy a parole board that he no longer posed danger to the community. Then came the line that would echo through news coverage and social media and true crime discussions for years afterward. The sentence that captured the judge's assessment of Noah's trajectory if he continued on his current path. She leaned forward, made direct eye contact with Noah, and said in a voice that was calm but carried absolute conviction, "Mr. Klein, you have been sentenced to life with the possibility of parole in 40 years. Whether you ever see freedom depends entirely on who you become during those 40 years. If you continue to view yourself as a victim, if you continue to prioritize your own comfort over accountability for what you've done, then if you continue to smile when you should be grieving and perform remorse you don't feel, then you will die in prison. Parole boards do not release people who remain dangerous, and someone who cannot feel genuine empathy for the person they murdered, who cannot take full responsibility without deflecting blame, who cannot demonstrate that they understand why what they did was not just illegal, but morally catastrophic. That person remains dangerous regardless of how much time passes. You are 13 years old. You have the opportunity to grow into someone different than who you are today. But growth requires honesty, and so far you have shown very little of that." The courtroom absorbed her words in absolute silence. The conditional nature of the sentence transforming punishment from simple incarceration into a test that would last decades. A challenge Noah could pass only by becoming fundamentally different than the boy who sat before her, wearing a mask of compliance while his eyes darted around, looking for escape routes that didn't exist. The gavel fell with a sound that seemed to echo longer than physics allowed, a punctuation mark that ended not just the hearing, but the active phase of a case that had consumed Briar Glen for nearly a year. Noah stood when directed by the bailiffs, his face cycling through emotions too rapidly to catalog. Shock, anger, fear, and something that might have been the first genuine comprehension that his childhood had ended, not metaphorically, but literally. That the next time he experienced freedom, he would be middle-aged if he experienced it at all. That the judge's words weren't rhetorical flourish, but actual prediction of his future if he couldn't transform himself in ways that currently seemed beyond his capacity. The handcuffs clicked onto his wrists with that distinctive metallic sound that had become the audio signature of his new reality. And as he was led from the courtroom, he turned back once. Not to his parents, who sat frozen in their seats, not to his attorney, who was already gathering papers with the mechanical movements of exhaustion, but toward the gallery where he seemed to be searching for something, some reaction or validation or final piece of attention before the door closed between his old life and whatever came next. What he saw was a courtroom full of people who looked through him rather than at him, whose attention had already shifted to the Harper family rising to leave, whose interest in Noah Klein had been satisfied by the verdict and sentence, and now moved toward the harder work of figuring out how to exist in a world that felt fundamentally altered by knowledge that children could be murderers and best friends could be killers, and safety was a story communities told themselves until reality proved otherwise. In the weeks that followed sentencing, Briar Glen attempted the complicated work of returning to normal rhythms, while acknowledging that normal had been permanently redefined by what had happened within its boundaries. The Greenbelt path reopened to foot traffic after months of being treated as crime scene and memorial site. Though usage patterns changed, parents walked with children where previously children had roamed alone, dog walkers moved in pairs instead of solo, and the drainage area where Eli's body had been found remained informally avoided, vegetation growing thick around the edges as though nature itself was reclaiming space that humans had marked as haunted. A memorial bench was installed at the trailhead with a plaque reading, "Eli Harper, 2010 to 2023, Forever 13, Forever Loved," the kind of permanent marker that served both as remembrance and as warning, a physical reminder that tragedy had occurred here and vigilance was required because danger didn't always announce itself with strangers' faces or obvious threats. Parents had conversations with their children that previous generations might have delayed, about friendship's complexity, about recognizing when relationships became toxic, about trusting instincts when something felt wrong, even if the wrongness came from someone familiar and trusted. The elementary school where Emma Harper attended installed new counseling programs focused on grief and trauma, acknowledging that Eli's death had affected children throughout the community who were learning earlier than anyone wanted that loss and violence weren't abstractions reserved for news reports about distant places. The Harper family's attempt to reconstruct daily life around the permanent absence at its center was documented through victim advocate reports and occasional media interviews that Marissa gave not because she enjoyed public attention, but because speaking Eli's name and insisting on his full humanity felt like the only meaningful action available to her in a situation where meaningful action was mostly impossible. She returned to work as a part-time nurse, finding that professional caregiving provided structure and purpose that private grief threatened to consume, though colleagues noticed she struggled with pediatric cases involving 13-year-old boys, requesting transfers or taking breaks when those assignments proved emotionally untenable. Eli's room remained largely unchanged for the first year. Marissa couldn't bear to pack his belongings or transform the space into something else, because doing so felt like erasure, like agreeing that he was truly gone in a way her heart refused to accept, even when her rational mind knew the truth. Emma started therapy twice weekly, working through nightmares and separation anxiety, and the complicated grief of losing a sibling who'd been protector and playmate and constant presence, her childhood truncated by knowledge that the world was less safe than adults had promised, and that the people you loved could vanish without warning or reprieve. The family's grief wasn't linear or tidy, didn't progress through neat stages toward resolution, but instead moved in cycles, periods of functionality interrupted by waves of acute pain triggered by ordinary moments like hearing a song Eli had liked, or encountering a friend wearing shoes similar to ones he'd owned, or experiencing the brutal mathematics of holidays and birthdays that highlighted his permanent absence. Noah Klein entered the adult correctional system as its youngest resident, a status that created immediate complications because housing a 13-year-old among adult offenders required special protocols designed to prevent victimization while also not providing accommodations that might undermine the sentence's punitive purpose. He was placed in a unit designated for young offenders serving long sentences, A population of late teens and early 20s inmates who'd committed serious crimes as juveniles and been transferred to adult court, a cohort that shared his legal status, if not his extreme youth. Initial reports from correctional staff noted that Noah struggled with institutional adjustment, receiving behavioral infractions for refusing directives, attempting to manipulate staff through performances of distress or compliance that appeared calculated rather than authentic, and engaging in conflicts with other inmates that suggested his need for control and inability to read social dynamics appropriately. Persisted even in an environment where such limitations carried immediate physical consequences. The psychological evaluations mandated as part of his sentence structure documented that Noah participated in required counseling but remained resistant to authentic engagement, that he could articulate correct answers about remorse and accountability when prompted but demonstrated little evidence of genuine emotional processing, that he continued to frame himself primarily as victim of circumstances rather than author of choices that had ended someone's life. The question that haunted everyone who'd been involved in the case, from detectives to prosecutors to jurors to the judge herself, was whether Noah Klein possessed the capacity for the transformation that his sentence demanded, whether 40 years was enough time for a 13-year-old to develop empathy that seemed absent at a foundational level, to whether the neural plasticity experts testified about could actually produce someone fundamentally different, or whether certain limitations were permanent regardless of intervention or maturation. Judge Rourke's words, "You will die in prison," had been conditional, a prediction rather than pronouncement, but they carried weight because they articulated what many people believed. That Noah's smiles and flat effect and self-focused allocution revealed something deeper than developmental immaturity, something that looked less like a child struggling with complex emotions and more like a person fundamentally disconnected from other people's full humanity, someone for whom empathy was performance rather than authentic experience. The correctional psychologists tasked with his long-term treatment faced the professional challenge of maintaining hope for rehabilitation while honestly assessing whether their interventions were producing change or simply teaching Noah more sophisticated versions of the manipulation that had characterized his behavior throughout trial. The answer wouldn't be known for decades, wouldn't be determinable until Noah faced parole boards in his 50s and they evaluated whether the person before them demonstrated genuine transformation or simply better acting skills developed over 40 years of practice. The legal system's response to Noah's case rippled outward in ways that affected juvenile justice policy and prosecution decisions in jurisdictions far beyond Briar Glen, his trial becoming reference material in debates about transfer procedures and sentencing structures and the constitutional requirements for treating youth offenders differently than adults, while still acknowledging that some crimes carried such severity that purely rehabilitative responses felt inadequate. Defense attorneys cited Noah's case as evidence that developmental neuroscience needed greater weight in transfer decisions, that 13-year-olds were categorically different from 17-year-olds in ways that should affect charging decisions, that adult prosecution of middle schoolers represented a failure of imagination about rehabilitation's possibilities. Prosecutors cited the same case as evidence that age alone couldn't override other factors like planning, premeditation, consciousness of guilt, and absence of remorse. That some actions demonstrated such concerning psychology that community safety required lengthy incarceration regardless of the offender's youth. Victims' rights advocates pointed to the Harper family's impact statements as evidence that justice required centering victims' voices rather than allowing defense mitigation to dominate sentencing narratives. The case became a Rorschach test where observers' pre-existing beliefs about punishment versus rehabilitation, about childhood innocence versus accountability, about whether people could fundamentally change or whether character was essentially fixed, all found confirmation in different aspects of the evidence and outcome. For Marissa Harper, the question of whether Noah might someday be released on parole was simultaneously irrelevant and consuming. irrelevant because nothing about his future could restore what she'd lost, consuming because the idea that he might experience freedom while Eli remained permanently absent felt like injustice, compounding tragedy. Like the system saying Noah's potential future mattered more than Eli's stolen one. She'd attended every parole hearing she was legally entitled to attend, planned to continue doing so for as long as she lived, determined to ensure that any parole board considering Noah's release would hear detailed testimony about what he'd taken and who Eli had been, and why letting Noah out would feel like society choosing his convenience over her son's memory. But she also understood the exhaustion of carrying rage for decades, the way that making Noah's punishment her life's purpose would give him power over her remaining years that she didn't want him to have, that at some point she'd need to find meaning beyond victimhood, or risk letting his actions define her as thoroughly as they defined Eli's end. The tension between those competing needs, holding him accountable and releasing herself from bondage to his existence, was something she navigated daily, some days feeling capable of forgiveness's possibility, and other days certain that forgiveness would be betrayal of her son's memory, the emotional mathematics never resolving into clean answers, but instead requiring constant recalculation. The story of Noah Klein and Eli Harper became one of those cases that true crime communities return to repeatedly, are generating podcast episodes and documentary treatments and online discussions that analyzed every decision point, where different choices might have produced different outcomes. If parents had stored the gun more securely, if teachers had escalated behavioral concerns more aggressively, if friends had reported Noah's troubling patterns earlier, if Eli had told someone he felt uncomfortable around Noah in those final weeks. If any of 100 small interventions had occurred, would tragedy have been prevented or merely postponed? These discussions generated frustration among those who'd lived through the actual events rather than consuming them as entertainment, because Monday morning quarterbacking was easy when you weren't the parent trying to distinguish normal adolescent difficulty from dangerous pathology, when you weren't the teacher managing 30 students with limited mental health resources, when you weren't the 13-year-old trying to be loyal to a friendship that was becoming toxic without having vocabulary or framework to recognize toxicity's signs. But the discussions also served a purpose, forcing communities everywhere to examine their own assumptions about safety and supervision and the signs that danger might be developing in plain sight, disguised as ordinary teenage drama. In the end, the case resolved nothing about the larger questions it raised, whether children who commit terrible crimes are fundamentally different from other children, or whether circumstances and choices and random factors converge in ways that could theoretically affect anyone, whether justice required treating juvenile offenders as redeemable by definition, or whether honest assessment sometimes demanded acknowledging that redemption wasn't guaranteed regardless of age, whether a system built on hope for human transformation could maintain that hope when confronted with someone who smiled at his victim's mother in a courtroom. What the case provided instead of resolution was witness, a record that Eli Harper had lived and mattered and been loved, that his death wasn't accepted as inevitable or minimized through legal technicalities, that the community had seen what happened and named it correctly and imposed consequences even when those consequences felt inadequate compared to the permanence of loss. For the Harper family, that witness was all the justice system could offer. And while it wasn't healing, and it wasn't restoration, and it wasn't enough to fill the absence that defined their lives, it was the difference between meaningless death and death that received proper acknowledgement. They carried Eli's memory forward not as a cautionary tale, but as a complete person who'd existed beyond the fact of his murder, whose laugh and kindness and trust and ordinary adolescent dreams deserved remembrance. The final image that stayed with everyone who'd participated in the trial was from the moment after sentencing concluded, when the courtroom had emptied and only the Harper family remained, sitting together in the front row where they'd maintained vigil throughout proceedings. They weren't crying. They'd exhausted tears days ago. They were just sitting in exhausted silence, all holding each other in the way people do when words have been used up and only physical presence remains. Marissa held a photograph of Eli from the summer before his death, a candid shot of him laughing at something outside the frame, his face open and unguarded in the way that only happened when you didn't know you were being watched, when you weren't performing for cameras, but just existing in a moment that felt safe and happy and ordinary. That photograph, that evidence of who Eli had been before fear and violence and death, was the truth the courtroom had tried to honor. Noah Klein had walked out of the Greenbelt alone that Saturday afternoon, had tried to erase what he'd done, had smiled when he should have grieved. But he hadn't erased Eli. The smile had disappeared under the weight of 40 years. And Eli's name remained. Spoken by people who'd loved him, remembered by a community that had learned too late that safety required vigilance and that trust was a gift that should be granted carefully because some people treated it as weapon rather than bond. The gavel's echo faded. The courtroom lights dimmed. And in the space where justice and grief and consequence all converged, the only certainty was that Eli Harper had mattered, and that truth would outlast every other element of a story no one should have had to live.